The Sophist and the Statesman by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett. The first section, the Sophist. Persons of the dialogue:
Theodorus,
Theaetetus,
Socrates,
an Eleatic stranger,
whom Theodorus and Theaetetus bring with them,
the younger Socrates,
who is a silent auditor.
Here we are, Socrates, true to our agreement of yesterday, and we bring with us a stranger from Elea, who is a disciple of Parmenides and Zeno, and a true philosopher.
Is he not rather a god, Theodorus, who comes to us in the disguise of a stranger? For Homer says that all the gods, and especially the god of strangers, are companions of the meek and just, and visit the good and evil among men. And may not your companion be one of those higher powers, a cross-examining deity, who has come to spy out our weakness in argument and to cross-examine us?
Nay, Socrates, he is not one of the disputatious sort. He is too good for that, and in my opinion he is not a god at all, but divine he certainly is, for this is a title which I should give to all philosophers.
Capital, my friend, and I may add that they are almost as hard to be discerned as the gods. For the true philosophers, and such as are not merely made up for the occasion, appear in various forms unrecognized by the ignorance of men, and they hover about cities, as Homer declares, looking from above upon human life, and some think nothing of them, and others can never think enough, and sometimes they appear as statesmen, and sometimes as sophists, and then, again, to many they seem to be no better than madmen. I should like to ask our Eleatic friend if he would tell us what is thought about them in Italy, and to whom the terms are applied.
What terms?
Sophist, statesman, philosopher.
What is your difficulty about them, and what made you ask?
I want to know whether by his countrymen they are regarded as one or two, or do they, as the names are three, distinguish also three kinds, and assign one to each name?
I dare say that the stranger will not object to discuss the question. What do you say, stranger?
I am far from objecting, Theodorus, nor have I any difficulty in replying that by us they are regarded as three, but to define precisely the nature of each of them is by no means a slight or easy task.
You have happened to light, Socrates, almost on the very question which we were asking our friend before we came hither, and he excused himself to us, as he does now to you, although he admitted that the matter had been fully discussed, and that he remembered the answer.
Then do not, stranger, deny us the first favour which we ask of you. I am sure that you will not, and therefore I shall only beg of you to say whether you like, and are accustomed to make a long oration on a subject which you want to explain to another, or to proceed by the method of question and answer. I remember hearing a very noble discussion in which Parmenides employed the latter of the two methods, when I was a young man, and he was far advanced in years. Compare Parm.
I prefer to talk with another when he responds pleasantly, and is light in hand. If not, I would rather have my own say.
Any one of the present company will respond kindly to you, and you can choose whom you like of them. I should recommend you to take a young person, Theaetetus, for example, unless you have a preference for someone else.
I feel ashamed, Socrates, being a newcomer into your society, instead of talking a little and hearing others talk, to be spinning out a long soliloquy or address, as if I wanted to show off. For the true answer will certainly be a very long one, a great deal longer than might be expected from such a short and simple question. At the same time, I fear that I may seem rude and ungracious if I refuse your courteous request, especially after what you have said, for I certainly cannot object to your proposal that Theaetetus should respond, having already conversed with him myself, and being recommended by you to take him.
But are you sure, stranger, that this will be quite so acceptable to the rest of the company as Socrates imagines?
You hear them applauding, Theaetetus. After that there is nothing more to be said. Well then, I am to argue with you, and if you tire of the argument, you may complain of your friends, and not of me.
I do not think that I shall tire, and if I do, I shall get my friend here, young Socrates, the namesake of the elder Socrates, to help. He is about my own age, and my partner at the gymnasium, and is constantly accustomed to work with me.
Very good. You can decide about that for yourself as we proceed. Meanwhile, you and I will begin together and inquire into the nature of the Sophist, first of the three. I should like you to make out what he is, and bring him to light in a discussion, For at present we are only agreed about the name, but of the thing to which we both apply the name. Possibly you have one notion, and I another, whereas we ought always to come to an understanding about the thing itself in terms of a definition, and not merely about the name minus the definition. Now the tribe of Sophists, which we are investigating, is not easily caught or defined, and the world has long ago agreed that if great subjects are to be adequately treated, they must be studied in the lesser and easier instances of them before we proceed to the greatest of all. And as I know that the tribe of Sophists is troublesome and hard to be caught, I should recommend that we practice beforehand the method which is to be applied to him on some simple and smaller thing, unless you can suggest a better way.
Indeed I cannot.
Then suppose that we work out some lesser example which will be a pattern of the greater.
Good.
What is there which is well known and not great, and is yet as susceptible of definition as any larger thing? Shall I say an angler? He is familiar to all of us, and not a very interesting or important person.
He is not.
Yet I suspect that he will furnish us with the sort of definition and line of inquiry which we want.
Very good.
Let us begin by asking whether he is a man having art or not having art, but some other power.
He is clearly a man of art.
And of arts there are two kinds.
What are they?
There is agriculture and the tending of mortal creatures and the art of constructing or moulding vessels, and there is the art of imitation. All these may be appropriately called by a single name.
What do you mean? And what is the name?
He who brings into existence something that did not exist before is said to be a producer, and that which is brought into existence is said to be produced.
True.
And all the arts which were just now mentioned are characterized by this power of producing?
They are.
Then let us sum them up under the name of productive or creative art.
Very good.
Next follows the whole class of learning and cognition. Then comes trade, fighting, hunting. And since none of these produces anything, but is only engaged in conquering by word or deed, or in preventing others from conquering, things which exist and have been already produced, in each and all of these branches there appears to be an art which may be called acquisitive.
Yes, that is the proper name.
Seeing then that all arts are either acquisitive or creative, in which class shall we place the art of the angler?
Clearly in the acquisitive class.
And the acquisitive may be subdivided into two parts. There is exchange, which is voluntary, and is effected by gifts, hire, purchase, and the other part of acquisitive, which takes by force of word or deed, may be termed conquest.
That is implied in what has been said.
And may not conquest be again subdivided?
How?
Open force may be called fighting, and secret force may have the general name of hunting?
Yes.
And there is no reason why the art of hunting should not be further divided.
How would you make the division?
Into the hunting of living and of lifeless prey.
Yes, if both kinds exist.
Of course they exist, but the hunting after lifeless things having no special name, except some sorts of diving and other small matters, may be omitted. The hunting after living things may be called animal hunting.
Yes.
And animal hunting may be truly said to have two divisions: land animal hunting, which has many kinds and names, and water animal hunting, or the hunting after animals who swim.
True.
And of swimming animals, one class lives on the wing and the other in the water.
Certainly.
Fowling is the general term under which the hunting of all birds is included.
True.
The hunting of animals who live in the water has the general name of fishing.
Yes.
And this sort of hunting may be further divided also into two principal kinds.
What are they?
There is one kind which takes them in nets, another which takes them by a blow.
What do you mean, and how do you distinguish them?
As to the first kind, all that surrounds and encloses anything to prevent egress may be rightly called an enclosure.
Very true.
For which reason twig baskets, casting nets, nooses, creels and the like may all be termed enclosures.
True.
And therefore this first kind of capture may be called by us capture with enclosures, or something of that sort.
Yes.
The other kind, which is practiced by a blow with hooks and three-pronged spears, when summed up under one name, may be called striking, unless you, Theaetetus, can find some better name.
Never mind the name, what you suggest will do very well.
There is one mode of striking which is done at night and by the light of a fire, and is by the hunters themselves called firing, or spearing by firelight.
True.
And the fishing by day is called by the general name of barbing, because the spears too are barbed at the point.
Yes, that is the term.
Of this barb fishing, that which strikes the fish who is below from above is called spearing, because this is the way in which the three-pronged spears are mostly used.
Yes, it is often called so.
Then now there is only one kind remaining.
What is that?
When a hook is used and the fish is not struck in any chance part of his body, as he is with the spear, but only about the head and mouth, and is then drawn out from below upwards with reeds and rods. What is the right name of that mode of fishing, Theaetetus?
I suspect that we have now discovered the object of our search.
Then now you and I have come to an understanding not only about the name of the angler's art, but about the definition of the thing itself. One half of all art was acquisitive. Half of the acquisitive art was conquest or taking by force. Half of this was hunting, and half of hunting was hunting animals. Half of this was hunting water animals. Of this again, the under half was fishing. Half of fishing was striking. A part of striking was fishing with a barb, and one half of this again, being the kind which strikes with a hook and draws the fish from below upwards, is the art which we have been seeking, and which from the nature of the operation is denoted angling or drawing up, aspalutique, anaspastai.
The result has been quite satisfactorily brought out.
And now, following this pattern, let us endeavour to find out what a sophist is.
By all means.
The first question about the angler was whether he was a skilled artist or unskilled.
True.
And shall we call our new friend unskilled or a thorough master of his craft?
Certainly not unskilled, for his name, as indeed you imply, must surely express his nature.
Then he must be supposed to have some art.
What art?
By heaven, they are cousins. It never occurred to us. And
Who are cousins?
the angler and the sophist.
In what way are they related?
They both appear to me to be hunters. And
How the sophist? Of the other we have spoken.
you remember our division of hunting into hunting after swimming animals and land animals?
Yes.
And you remember that we subdivided the swimming and left the land animals, saying that there were many kinds of them.
Certainly.
Thus far, then, the sophist and the angler, starting from the art of acquiring, take the same road.
So it would appear.
Their paths diverge when they reach the art of animal hunting, the one going to the seashore, and to the rivers and to the lakes, and angling for the animals which are in them,
Very true.
while the other goes to land and water of another sort, rivers of wealth and broad meadowlands of generous youth, and he also is intending to take the animals which are in them.
What do you mean?
Of hunting on land there are two principal divisions.
What are they?
One is the hunting of tame and the other of wild animals. And
But are tame animals ever hunted?
yes, if you include man under tame animals. But if you like, you may say that there are no tame animals, or that if there are, man is not among them. Or you may say that man is a tame animal but is not hunted. You shall decide which of these alternatives you prefer.
I should say, stranger, that man is a tame animal, and I admit that he is hunted.
Then let us divide the hunting of tame animals into two parts.
How shall we make the division?
Let us define piracy, man-stealing, tyranny, the whole military art by one name as hunting with violence.
Very good.
But the art of the lawyer, of the popular orator, and the art of conversation may be called in one word, the art of persuasion.
True.
And of persuasion there may be said to be two kinds.
What are they?
One is private and the other public.
Yes. Each of them forms a class.
And of private hunting, one sort receives hire and the other brings gifts.
I do not understand you.
You seem never to have observed the manner in which lovers hunt.
To what do you refer?
I mean that they lavish gifts on those whom they hunt, in addition to other inducements.
Most true.
Let us admit this then to be the amatory art.
Certainly.
But that sort of hireling whose conversation is pleasing, and who baits his hook only with pleasure, and exacts nothing but his maintenance in return, we should all, if I am not mistaken, describe as possessing flattery or an art of making things pleasant.
Certainly.
And that sort which professes to form acquaintances only for the sake of virtue, and demands a reward in the shape of money, may be fairly called by another name.
To be sure.
And what is the name, will you tell me?
It is obvious enough. For I believe that we have discovered the sophist, which is, as I conceive, the proper name for the class described.
Then now, Theaetetus, his art may be traced as a branch of the appropriative acquisitive family which hunts animals, living land, tame animals, which hunts man, privately, for hire, taking money in exchange, having the semblance of education, and this is termed sophistry, and is a hunt after young men of wealth and rank. Such is the conclusion.
Just so.
Let us take another branch of his genealogy, for he is a professor of a great and many-sided art, and if we look back at what has preceded, we see that he presents another aspect, besides that of which we are speaking.
In what respect?
There were two sorts of acquisitive art, the one concerned with hunting, the other with exchange.
There were.
And of the art of exchange there are two divisions, the one of giving and the other of selling.
Let us assume that.
Next we will suppose the art of selling to be divided into two parts.
How?
There is one part which is distinguished as the sale of a man's own productions, another which is the exchange of the works of others.
Certainly.
And is not that part of exchange which takes place in the city, being about half of the whole, termed retailing?
Yes.
And that which exchanges the goods of one city for those of another by selling and buying is the exchange of the merchant.
To be sure.
And you are aware that this exchange of the merchant is of two kinds. It is partly concerned with food for the use of the body, and partly with the food of the soul, which is bartered and received in exchange for money.
What do you mean?
You want to know what is the meaning of food for the soul, the other kind you surely understand.
Yes.
Take music in general and painting and marionette playing and many other things, which are purchased in one city and carried away and sold in another. Wares of the soul which are hawked about either for the sake of instruction or amusement. May not he who takes them about and sells them be quite as truly called a merchant as he who sells meats and drinks?
To be sure he may.
And would you not call by the same name him who buys up knowledge and goes about from city to city exchanging his wares for money?
Certainly I should.
Of this merchandise of the soul may not one part be fairly termed the art of display? And there is another part which is certainly not less ridiculous, but being a trade in learning must be called by some name germane to the matter?
Certainly.
The latter should have two names, one descriptive of the sale of the knowledge of virtue, and the other of the sale of other kinds of knowledge.
Of course.
The name of art seller corresponds well enough to the latter, but you must try and tell me the name of the other.
He must be the sophist, whom we are seeking. No other name can possibly be right.
No other. And so this trader in virtue again turns out to be our friend the sophist, whose art may now be traced from the art of acquisition through exchange, trade, merchandise, to a merchandise of the soul which is concerned with speech and the knowledge of virtue.
Quite true.
And there may be a third reappearance of him, for he may have settled down in a city and may fabricate as well as buy these same wares, intending to live by selling them, and he would still be called a sophist.
Certainly.
Then that part of the acquisitive art which exchanges, and of exchange which either sells a man's own productions or retails those of others, as the case may be, and in either way sells the knowledge of virtue, you would again term sophistry.
I must, if I am to keep pace with the argument.
Let us consider once more whether there may not be yet another aspect of sophistry.
What is it?
In the acquisitive there was a subdivision of the combative or fighting art.
There was.
Perhaps we had better divide it.
What shall be the divisions?
There shall be one division of the competitive and another of the pugnacious.
Very good.
That part of the pugnacious which is a contest of bodily strength may be properly called by some such name as violent.
True.
And when the war is one of words, it may be termed controversy?
Yes.
And controversy may be of two kinds.
What are they?
When long speeches are answered by long speeches and there is public discussion about the just and unjust, that is forensic controversy.
Yes.
And there is a private sort of controversy which is cut up into questions and answers, and this is commonly called disputation.
Yes, that is the name.
And of disputation, that sort which is only a discussion about contracts, and is carried on at random, and without rules of art, is recognized by the reasoning faculty to be a distinct class, but has hitherto had no distinctive name and does not deserve to receive one from us.
No, for the different sorts of it are too minute and heterogeneous.
But that which proceeds by rules of art to dispute about justice and injustice in their own nature, and about things in general, we have been accustomed to call argumentation, heuristic.
Certainly.
And of argumentation one sort wastes money and the other makes money.
Very true.
Suppose we try and give to each of these two classes a name.
Let us do so.
I should say that the habit which leads a man to neglect his own affairs for the pleasure of conversation, of which the style is far from being agreeable to the majority of his hearers, may be fairly termed loquacity, such is my opinion.
That is the common name for it.
But now who the other is, who makes money out of private disputation, it is your turn to say.
There is only one true answer. He is the wonderful sophist, of whom we are in pursuit, and who reappears again for the fourth time.
Yes, and with a fresh pedigree, for he is the money-making species of the eristic, disputatious, controversial, pugnacious, combative, acquisitive family, as the argument has already proven.
Certainly.
How true was the observation that he was a many-sided animal, and not to be caught with one hand, as they say.
Then you must catch him with two.
Yes, we must, if we can, and therefore let us try another track in our pursuit of him. You are aware that there are certain menial occupations which have names among servants?
Yes, there are many such. Which of them do you mean?
I mean such as sifting, straining, winnowing, threshing, and...
Certainly.
And besides these there are a great many more, such as carding, spinning, adjusting the warp and the woof, and thousands of similar expressions are used in the arts.
Of what are they to be patterns, and what are we going to do with them all?
I think that in all of these there is implied a notion of division.
Yes.
Then if, as I was saying, there is one art which includes all of them, ought not that art to have one name?
And what is the name of the art?
The art of discerning or discriminating.
Very good.
Think whether you cannot divide this.
I should have to think a long while.
In all the previously named processes, either like has been separated from like, or the better from the worse.
I see now what you mean.
There is no name for the first kind of separation. Of the second, which throws away the worse and preserves the better, I do know a name.
What is it?
Every discernment or discrimination of that kind, as I have observed, is called a purification.
Yes, that is the usual expression.
And anyone may see that purification is of two kinds.
Perhaps so, if he were allowed time to think, but I do not see at this moment.
There are many purifications of bodies which may with propriety be comprehended under a single name.
What are they, and what is their name?
There is the purification of living bodies in their inward and in their outward parts, of which the former is duly effected by medicine and gymnastic, the latter by the not very dignified art of the bathman. And there is the purification of inanimate substances. To this the arts of fulling and of furbishing in general attend in a number of minute particulars, having a variety of names which are thought ridiculous.
Very true.
There can be no doubt that they are thought ridiculous, Theaetetus. But then the dialectical art never considers whether the benefit to be derived from the purge is greater or less than that to be derived from the sponge, and has not more interest in the one than in the other. Her endeavour is to know what is and is not kindred in all arts, with a view to the acquisition of intelligence, and having this in view, she honours them all alike, and when she makes comparisons she counts one of them not a whit more ridiculous than another. Nor does she esteem him who adduces as his example of hunting, the general's art, at all more decorous than another who cites that of the vermin-destroyer, but only as the greater pretender of the two. And as to your question concerning the name which was to comprehend all these arts of purification, whether of animate or inanimate bodies, the art of dialectic is in no wise particular about fine words, if she may be only allowed to have a general name for all other purifications, binding them up together and separating them off from the purification of the soul or intellect. For this is the purification at which she wants to arrive, and this we should understand to be her aim.
Yes, I understand. And I agree that there are two sorts of purification, and that one of them is concerned with the soul, and that there is another which is concerned with the body.
Excellent. And now listen to what I am going to say, and try to divide further the first of the two.
Whatever line of division you suggest, I will endeavour to assist you.
Do we admit that virtue is distinct from vice in the soul?
Certainly.
And purification was to leave the good, and to cast out whatever is bad.
True.
Then any taking away of evil from the soul may be properly called purification?
Yes.
And in the soul there are two kinds of evil.
What are they?
The one may be compared to disease in the body, the other to deformity.
I do not understand.
Perhaps you have never reflected that disease and discord are the same.
To this, again, I know not what I should reply.
Do you not conceive discord to be a dissolution of kindred elements, originating in some disagreement?
Just that.
And is deformity anything but the want of measure, which is always unsightly?
Exactly.
And do we not see that opinion is opposed to desire, pleasure to anger, reason to pain, and that all these elements are opposed to one another in the souls of bad men?
Certainly.
And yet they must all be akin.
Of course, and
Then we shall be right in calling vice a discord and disease of the soul?
most true.
And when things having motion and aiming at an appointed mark continually miss their aim and glance aside, shall we say that this is the effect of symmetry among them, or of the want of symmetry?
clearly of the want of symmetry.
But surely we know that no soul is voluntarily ignorant of anything.
Certainly not.
And what is ignorance but the aberration of a mind which is bent on truth, and in which the process of understanding is perverted?
True.
Then we are to regard an unintelligent soul as deformed and devoid of symmetry.
Very true.
Then there are these two kinds of evil in the soul, the one which is generally called vice, and is obviously a disease of the soul.
Yes.
And there is the other, which they call ignorance, and which, because existing only in the soul, they will not allow to be vice.
I certainly admit what I at first disputed, that there are two kinds of vice in the soul, and that we ought to consider cowardice, intemperance, and injustice to be alike forms of disease in the soul, and ignorance, of which there are all sorts of varieties, to be deformity.
And in the case of the body, are there not two arts which have to do with the two bodily states?
What are they?
There is gymnastic, which has to do with deformity, and medicine, which has to do with disease.
True.
And where there is insolence and injustice and cowardice, is not chastisement the art which is most required?
That certainly appears to be the opinion of mankind.
Again, of the various kinds of ignorance, may not instruction be rightly said to be the remedy?
True.
And of the art of instruction, shall we say that there is one or many kinds? At any rate, there are two principal ones. Think.
I will.
I believe that I can see how we shall soonest arrive at the answer to this question.
How?
If we can discover a line which divides ignorance into two halves. For a division of ignorance into two parts will certainly imply that the art of instruction is also twofold, answering to the two divisions of ignorance.
Well, and do you see what you are looking for?
I do seem to myself to see one very large and bad sort of ignorance, which is quite separate, and may be weighed in the scale against all other sorts of ignorance put together.
What is it?
When a person supposes that he knows and does not know, this appears to be the great source of all the errors of the intellect.
True.
And this, if I am not mistaken, is the kind of ignorance which specially earns the title of stupidity.
True.
What name, then, shall be given to the sort of instruction which gets rid of this?
The instruction which you mean, stranger, is, I should imagine, not the teaching of handicraft arts, but what, thanks to us, has been termed education in this part the world.
Yes, Theaetetus, and by nearly all Hellenes. But we have still to consider whether education admits of any further division.
We have.
I think that there is a point at which such a division is possible.
Where?
Of education, one method appears to be rougher and another smoother.
How are we to distinguish the two?
There is the time-honoured mode which our fathers commonly practice towards their sons, and which is still adopted by many, either of roughly reproving their errors or of gently advising them, which varieties may be correctly included under the general term of admonition.
True.
But whereas some appear to have arrived at the conclusion that all ignorance is involuntary, and that no one who thinks himself wise is willing to learn any of those things in which he is conscious of his own cleverness, and that the admonitory sort of instruction gives much trouble and does little good.
There they are quite right.
Accordingly, they set to work to eradicate the spirit of conceit in another way.
In what way?
They cross-examine a man's words when he thinks that he is saying something and is really saying nothing, and easily convict him of inconsistencies in his opinions. These they then collect by the dialectical process, and placing them side by side, show that they contradict one another about the same things, in relation to the same things, and in the same respect. He, seeing this, is angry with himself, and grows gentle towards others, and thus is entirely delivered from great prejudices and harsh notions, in a way which is most amusing to the hearer, and produces the most lasting good effect on the person who is the subject of the operation. For as the physician considers that the body will receive no benefit from taking food until the internal obstacles have been removed, so the purifier of the soul is conscious that his patient will receive no benefit from the application of knowledge until he is refuted, and from refutation learns modesty. He must be purged of his prejudices first, and made to think that he knows only what he knows, and no more.
That is certainly the best and wisest state of mind.
For all these reasons, Theaetetus, we must admit that refutation is the greatest and chiefest of purifications, and he who has not been refuted, though he be the great king himself, is in an awful state of impurity. He is uninstructed and deformed in those things in which he who would be truly blessed ought to be fairest and purest.
Very true.
And who are the ministers of this art? I am afraid to say the Sophists,
Why?
Lest we should assign to them too high a prerogative.
Yet the Sophist has a certain likeness to our Minister of Purification.
Yes, the same sort of likeness which a wolf, who is the fiercest of animals, has to a dog, who is the gentlest. But he who would not be found tripping ought to be very careful in this matter of comparisons, for they are most slippery things. Nevertheless, let us assume that the Sophists are the men. I say this provisionally, for I think that the line which divides them will be marked enough if proper care is taken.
Likely enough.
Let us grant, then, that from the discerning art comes purification, and from purification let there be separated off a part which is concerned with the soul. Of this mental purification instruction is a portion, and of instruction education, and of education that refutation of vain conceit which has been discovered in the present argument. And let this be called by you and me the nobly descended art of sophistry.
Very well. And yet, considering the number of forms in which he has presented himself, I begin to doubt how I can, with any truth or confidence, describe the real nature of the Sophist.
You naturally feel perplexed, and yet I think that he must be still more perplexed in his attempt to escape us, for as the proverb says, when every way is blocked, there is no escape. Now then, is the time of all others to set upon him.
True.
First let us wait a moment and recover breath, and while we are resting, we may reckon up in how many forms he has appeared. In the first place, he was discovered to be a paid hunter after wealth and youth.
Yes.
In the second place, he was a merchant in the goods of the soul.
Certainly.
In the third place, he has turned out to be a retailer of the same sort of wares.
Yes. And in the fourth place, he himself manufactured the learned wares which he sold.
Quite right. I will try and remember the fifth myself. He belonged to the fighting class, and was further distinguished as a hero of debate, who professed the eristic art.
True.
The sixth point was doubtful, and yet we at last agreed that he was a purger of souls, who cleared away notions obstructive to knowledge.
Very true.
Do you not see that when the professor of any art has one name and many kinds of knowledge, there must be something wrong? The multiplicity of names which is applied to him shows that the common principle to which all these branches of knowledge are tending is not understood.
I should imagine this to be the case.
At any rate, we will understand him, and no indolence shall prevent us. Let us begin again, then, and re-examine some of our statements concerning the Sophist. There was one thing which appeared to me especially characteristic of him.
To what are you referring?
We were saying of him, if I am not mistaken, that he was a disputer.
We were.
And does he not also teach others the art of disputation?
Certainly he does.
And about what does he profess that he teaches men to dispute? To begin at the beginning, does he make them able to dispute about divine things, which are invisible to men in general?
At any rate, he is said to do so.
And what do you say of the visible things in heaven and earth and the like?
Certainly he disputes and teaches to dispute about them.
Then again, in private conversation, when any universal assertion is made about generation and essence, we know that such persons are tremendous argufiers, and are able to impart their own skill to others.
Undoubtedly.
And do they not profess to make men able to dispute about law and about politics in general?
Why, no one would have anything to say to them if they did not make these professions.
In all and every art, what the craftsman ought to say in answer to any question is written down in a popular form, and he who likes may learn.
I suppose that you are referring to the precepts of Protagoras about wrestling and the other arts.
Yes, my friend, and about a good many other things. In a word, is not the art of disputation a power of disputing about all things?
Certainly. There does not seem to be much which is left out.
But, oh, my dear youth, do you suppose this possible? For perhaps your young eyes may see things which to our duller sight do not appear.
To what are you alluding? I do not think that I understand your present question.
I ask whether anybody can understand all things.
Happy would mankind be if such a thing were possible.
But how can anyone who is ignorant dispute in a rational manner against him who knows?
He cannot.
Then why has the sophistical art such a mysterious power?
To what do you refer?
How do the Sophists make young men believe in their supreme and universal wisdom? For if they neither disputed nor were thought to dispute rightly, or being thought to do so were deemed no wiser for their controversial skill, then, to quote your own observation, no one would give them money or be willing to learn their art.
They certainly would not.
But they are willing.
Yes, they are.
Yes, and the reason, as I should imagine, is that they are supposed to have knowledge of those things about which they dispute.
Certainly.
And they dispute about all things,
True.
and therefore to their disciples they appear to be all wise.
Certainly.
But they are not, for that was shown to be impossible.
Impossible, of course.
Then the sophist has been shown to have a sort of conjectural or apparent knowledge only of all things, which is not the truth.
Exactly. No better description of him could be given.
Let us now take an illustration which will still more clearly explain his nature.
What is it?
I will tell you, and you shall answer me, giving your very closest attention. Suppose that a person were to profess, not that he could speak or dispute, but that he knew how to make and do all things, by a single art.
All things?
I see that you do not understand the first word that I utter, for you do not understand the meaning of all.
No, I do not.
Under all things I include you and me, and also animals and trees.
What do you mean?
Suppose a person to say that he will make you and me and all creatures.
What would he mean by making? He cannot be a husbandman, for you said that he is a maker of animals.
Yes, and I say that he is also the maker of the sea and the earth and the heavens, and the gods and of all other things, and further, that he can make them in no time, and sell them for a few pence.
That must be a jest.
And when a man says that he knows all things and can teach them to another at a small cost, and in a short time, is not that a jest?
Certainly.
And is there any more artistic or graceful form of jest than imitation?
Certainly not. And imitation is a very comprehensive term, which includes under one class the most diverse sorts of things.
We know, of course, that he who professes by one art to make all things is really a painter, and by the painter's art makes resemblances of real things which have the same name with them, and he can deceive the less intelligent sort of young children to whom he shows his pictures at a distance, into the belief that he has the absolute power of making whatever he likes.
Certainly.
And may there not be supposed to be an imitative art of reasoning? Is it not possible to enchant the hearts of young men by words poured through their ears, when they are still at a distance from the truth of facts, by exhibiting to them fictitious arguments, and making them think that they are true, and that the speaker is the wisest of men in all things?
Yes. Why should there not be another such art?
But as time goes on, and their hearers advance in years, and come into closer contact with realities, and have learnt by sad experience to see and feel the truth of things, are not the greater part of them compelled to change many opinions which they formerly entertained, so that the great appears small to them, and the easy difficult, and all their dreamy speculations are overturned by the facts of life?
That is my view, as far as I can judge, although at my age, I may be one of those who see things at a distance only.
And the wish of all of us, who are your friends, is and always will be, to bring you as near to the truth as we can, without the sad reality. And now I should like you to tell me whether the sophist is not visibly a magician and imitator of true being, or are we still disposed to think that he may have a true knowledge of the various matters about which he disputes?
But how can he, stranger? Is there any doubt after what has been said that he is to be located in one of the divisions of children's play?
Then we must place him in the class of magicians and mimics.
Certainly we must.
And now our business is not to let the animal out, for we have got him in a sort of dialectical net, and there is one thing which he decidedly will not escape.
What is that?
The inference that he is a juggler.
Precisely my own opinion of him.
Then clearly we ought as soon as possible to divide the image-making art, and go down into the net, and, if the sophist does not run away from us, to seize him according to orders and deliver him over to reason, who is the lord of the hunt, and proclaim the capture of him. And if he creeps into the recesses of the imitative art, and secretes himself in one of them, to divide again and follow him up until in some subsection of imitation he is caught. For our method of tackling each and all is one which neither he nor any other creature will ever escape in triumph.
Well said, and let us do as you propose.
Well then, pursuing the same analytic method as before, I think that I can discern two divisions of the imitative art, but I am not as yet able to see in which of them the desired form is to be found.
Will you tell me first what are the two divisions of which you are speaking?
One is the art of likeness-making. Generally, a likeness of anything is made by producing a copy which is executed according to the proportions of the original, similar in length and breadth and depth, each thing receiving also its appropriate colour.
Is not this always the aim of imitation?
Not always. In works either of sculpture or of painting, which are of any magnitude, there is a certain degree of deception. For artists were to give the true proportions of their fair works. The upper part, which is farther off, would appear to be out of proportion in comparison with the lower, which is nearer. And so they give up the truth in their images, and make only the proportions which appear to be beautiful, disregarding the real ones.
Quite true.
And that which being other is also like, may we not fairly call a likeness or image?
Yes.
And may we not, as I did just now, call that part of the imitative art, which is concerned with making such images, the art of likeness-making?
Let that be the name.
And what shall we call those resemblances of the beautiful, which appear such owing to the unfavourable position of the spectator, whereas if a person had the power of getting a correct view of works of such magnitude, they would appear not even like that to which they profess to be like? May we not call these appearances, since they appear only and are not really like?
Certainly.
There is a great deal of this kind of thing in painting and in all imitation.
Of course.
And may we not fairly call the sort of art which produces an appearance and not an image, fantastic art?
Most fairly.
These then are the two kinds of image-making, the art of making likenesses, and fantastic, or the art of making appearances.
True.
I was doubtful before in which of them I should place the Sophist, nor am I even now able to see clearly. Verily, he is a wonderful and inscrutable creature, and now in the cleverest manner he has got into an impossible place.
Yes, he has.
Do you speak advisedly, or are you carried away at the moment by the habit of assenting into giving a hasty answer?
May I ask to what you are referring?
My dear friend, we are engaged in a very difficult speculation. There can be no doubt of that. For how a thing can appear and seem and not be, or how a man can say a thing which is not true, has always been and still remains a very perplexing question. Can anyone say or think that falsehood really exists, and avoid being caught in a contradiction? Indeed, Theaetetus, the task is a difficult one.
Why?
He who says that falsehood exists has the audacity to assert the being of not being, for this is implied in the possibility of falsehood. But, my boy, in the days when I was a boy, the great Parmenides protested against this doctrine, and to the end of his life he continued to inculcate the same lesson, always repeating both in verse and out of verse. Keep your mind from this way of inquiry, for never will you show that not being is. Such is his testimony, which is confirmed by the very expression when sifted a little. Would you object to begin with the consideration of the words themselves?
Never mind about me. I am only desirous that you should carry on the argument in the best way, and that you should take me with you.
Very good, and now say, do we venture to utter the forbidden word, not being?
Certainly we do.
Let us be serious then, and consider the question neither in strife nor play. Suppose that one of the hearers of Parmenides was asked, to what is the term not being to be applied? Do you know what sort of object he would single out in reply, and what answer he would make to the inquirer?
That is a difficult question, and one not to be answered at all by a person like myself.
There is at any rate no difficulty in seeing that the predicate, not being, is not applicable to any being.
None, certainly.
And if not to being, then not to something.
Of course not.
It is also plain that in speaking of something we speak of being, for to speak of an abstract something naked and isolated from all being is impossible.
Impossible.
You mean by assenting to imply that he who says something must say some one thing?
Yes.
Some in the singular tie, you would say, is the sign of one. Some in the dual, tine of two. Some in the plural, tines of many.
Exactly.
Then he who says not something must say absolutely nothing.
Most assuredly.
And as we cannot admit that a man speaks and says nothing, he who says not being does not speak at all.
The difficulty of the argument can no further go.
Not yet, my friend, is the time for such a word, for there still remains of all perplexities the first and greatest, touching the very foundation of the matter.
What do you mean? Do not be afraid to speak.
To that which is may be attributed some other thing which is?
Certainly.
But can anything which is be attributed to that which is not?
Impossible.
And all number is to be reckoned among things which are?
Yes, surely number, if anything, has a real existence.
Then we must not attempt to attribute to not being number, either in the singular or plural.
The argument implies that we should be wrong in doing so.
But how can a man either express in words or even conceive in thought things which are not, or a thing which is not without number?
How indeed?
When we speak of things which are we not attributing plurality to not being?
Certainly.
But on the other hand, when we say what is not, do we not attribute unity?
Manifestly.
Nevertheless, we maintain that you may not and ought not to attribute being to not being.
Most true.
Do you see then that not being in itself can neither be spoken, uttered, or thought, but that it is unthinkable, unutterable, unspeakable, indescribable?
Quite true.
But if so, I was wrong in telling you just now that the difficulty which was coming is the greatest of all.
What? Is there a greater still behind?
Well, I am surprised after what has been said already, that you do not see the difficulty in which he who would refute the notion of not being is involved. For he is compelled to contradict himself as soon as he makes the attempt.
What do you mean? Speak more clearly.
Do not expect clearness from me. For I, who maintain that not being has no part either in the one or many, just now spoke and am still speaking of not being as one. For I say, not being. Do you understand?
Yes.
And a little while ago I said that not being is unutterable, unspeakable, indescribable. Do you follow?
I do, after a fashion.
When I introduced the word is, did I not contradict what I said before?
Clearly.
And in using the singular verb, did I not speak of not being as one?
Yes.
And when I spoke of not being as indescribable and unspeakable and unutterable, in using each of these words in the singular, did I not refer to not being as one?
Certainly.
And yet we say that, strictly speaking, it should not be defined as one or many, and should not even be called it, for the use of the word it would imply a form of unity.
Quite true.
How then can anyone put any faith in me? For now, as always, I am unequal to the refutation of not being, and therefore, as I was saying, do not look to me for the right way of speaking about not being. But come, let us try the experiment with you.
What do you mean?
Make a noble effort as becomes youth, and endeavour with all your might to speak of not being in a right manner, without introducing into it either existence or unity or plurality.
It would be a strange boldness in me which would attempt the task when I see you thus discomfited.
Say no more of ourselves, but until we find someone or other who can speak of not being without number, we must acknowledge that the sophist is a clever rogue who will not be got out of his hole.
Most true.
And if we say to him that he professes an art of making appearances, he will grapple with us and retort our argument upon ourselves. And when we call him an image maker, he will say, "Pray, what do you mean at all by an image?" And I should like to know, Theaetetus, how we can possibly answer the younker's question.
We shall doubtless tell him of the images which are reflected in water or in mirrors, also of sculptures, pictures, and other duplicates.
I see, Theaetetus, that you have never made the acquaintance of the sophist.
Why do you think so?
She will make believe to have his eyes shut or to have none.
What do you mean?
When you tell him of something existing in a mirror or in sculpture and address him as though he had eyes, he will laugh you to scorn and will pretend that he knows nothing of mirrors and streams or of sight at all. He will say that he is asking about an idea.
What can he mean?
The common notion pervading all these objects, which you speak of as many, and yet call by the single name of image, as though it were the unity under which they were all included. How will you maintain your ground against him?
How, stranger, can I describe an image except as something fashioned in the likeness of the true?
And do you mean this something to be some other true thing, or what do you mean?
Certainly not another true thing, but only a resemblance.
And you mean by true that which really is?
Yes.
And the not true is that which is the opposite of the true?
Exactly.
A resemblance, then, is not really real, if, as you say, not true.
Nay, but it is in a certain sense.
You mean to say not in a true sense?
Yes. It is in reality only an image.
Then what we call an image is in reality really unreal.
In what a strange complication of being and not being we are involved.
Strange. I should think so. See how, by his reciprocation of opposites, the many-headed sophist has compelled us, quite against our will, to admit the existence of not being.
Yes, indeed, I see.
The difficulty is how to define his art without falling into a contradiction.
How do you mean? And where does the danger lie?
When we say that he deceives us with an illusion and that his art is illusory, do we mean that our soul is led by his art to think falsely, or what do we mean?
There is nothing else to be said.
Again, false opinion is that form of opinion which thinks the opposite of the truth. You would assent.
Certainly.
You mean to say that false opinion thinks what is not, and
Of course.
does false opinion think that things which are not, or or that in a certain sense they are.
Things that are not must be imagined to exist in a certain sense, if any degree of falsehood is to be possible.
And does not false opinion also think that things which most certainly exist do not exist at all?
Yes.
And here again is falsehood?
Falsehood, yes.
And in like manner, a false proposition will be deemed to be one which asserts the non-existence of things which are, and the existence of things which are not.
There is no other way in which a false proposition can arise.
There is not, but the sophist will deny these statements. And indeed, how can any rational man assent to them, when the very expressions which we have just used were before acknowledged by us to be unutterable, unspeakable, indescribable, unthinkable? Do you see his point, Theaetetus?
Of course he will say that we are contradicting ourselves when we hazard the assertion that falsehood exists in opinion and in words. For in maintaining this, we are compelled over and over again to assert being of not being, which we admitted just now to be an utter impossibility.
How well you remember! And now it is high time to hold a consultation as to what we ought to do about the sophist. For if we persist in looking for him in the class of false workers and magicians, you see that the handles for objection and the difficulties which will arise are very numerous and obvious.
They are indeed.
We have gone through but a very small portion of them, and they are really infinite.
If that is the case, we cannot possibly catch the sophist.
Shall we then be so faint-hearted as to give him up?
Certainly not, I should say, if we can get the slightest hold upon him.
Will you then forgive me, and as your words imply, not be altogether displeased if I flinch a little from the grasp of such a sturdy argument?
To be sure I will.
I have a yet more urgent request to make,
Which is?
That you will promise not to regard me as a parricide,
And why?
because in self-defense I must test the philosophy of my father Parmenides, and try to prove by main force that in a certain sense not being is, and that being, on the other hand, is not.
Some attempt of the kind is clearly needed.
Yes, a blind man, as they say, might see that, and unless these questions are decided in one way or another, no one, when he speaks of false words, or false opinion, or idols, or images, or imitations, or appearances, or about the arts which are concerned with them, can avoid falling into ridiculous contradictions.
Most true.
And therefore I must venture to lay hands on my father's argument, for if I am to be over-scrupulous, I shall have to give the matter up.
Nothing in the world should ever induce us to do so.
I have a third little request which I wish to make.
What is it?
You heard me say what I have always felt and still feel, that I have no heart for this argument?
I did.
I tremble at the thought of what I have said and expect that you will deem me mad when you hear of my sudden changes and shiftings. Let me therefore observe that I am examining the question entirely out of regard for you.
There is no reason for you to fear that I shall impute any impropriety to you if you attempt this refutation and proof. Take heart, therefore, and proceed.
And where shall I begin the perilous enterprise? I think that the road which I must take is—
Which? Let me hear.
I think that we had better, first of all, consider the points which at present are regarded as self-evident, lest we may have fallen into some confusion, and be too ready to assent to one another, fancying that we are quite clear about them.
Say more distinctly what you mean.
I think that Parmenides and all ever yet undertook to determine the number and nature of existences talked to us in rather a light and easy strain.
How?
As if we had been children to whom they repeated each his own mythus or story. One said that there were 3 principles, and that at one time there was war between certain of them, and then again there was peace, and they were married and begat children and brought them up. And another spoke of 2 principles, a moist and a dry, or a hot and a cold, and made them marry and cohabit. The Eleatics, however, in our part of the world, say that all things are many in name, but in nature one. This is their mythus, which goes back to Xenophanes, and is even older. Then there are Ionian, and in more recent times Sicilian muses, who have arrived at the conclusion that to unite the 2 principles is safer, and to say that being is one and many, and that these are held together by enmity and friendship, ever parting, ever meeting, as the severer muses assert, while the gentler ones do not insist on the perpetual strife and peace, but admit a relaxation and alternation of them. Peace and unity sometimes prevailing under the sway of Aphrodite, and then again plurality and war, by reason of a principle of strife. Whether any of them spoke the truth in all this is hard to determine. Besides, antiquity and famous men should have reverence, and not be liable to accusations so serious. Yet one thing may be said of them without offence.
What thing?
That they went on their several ways disdaining to notice people like ourselves. They did not care whether they took us with them or left us behind them.
How do you mean?
I mean to say that when they talk of one, two, or more elements, which are or have become or are becoming, or again of heat mingling with cold, assuming in some other part of their works separations and mixtures, tell me, Theaetetus, do you understand what they mean by these expressions? When I was a younger man, I used to fancy that I understood quite well what was meant by the term not being, which is our present subject of dispute, and now you see in what a fix we are about it.
I see.
And very likely we have been getting into the same perplexity about being, and yet may fancy that when anybody utters the word, we understand him quite easily, although we do not know about not being. But we may be equally ignorant of both.
I dare say.
And the same may be said of all the terms just mentioned, and
True.
the consideration of most of them may be deferred, but we had better now discuss the chief captain and leader of them.
Of what are you speaking? You clearly think that we must first investigate what people mean by the word being.
You follow close at my heels, Theaetetus, for the right method, I conceive, will be to call into our presence the dualistic philosophers and to interrogate them. Come, we will say, ye who affirm that hot and cold or any other two principles are the universe, what is this term which you apply to both of them, and what do you mean when you say that both and each of them are? How are we to understand the word are? Upon your view, are we to suppose that there is a third principle over and above the other two, three in all, and not two? For clearly you cannot say that one of the two principles is being, and yet attribute being equally to both of them. For if you did, whichever of the two is identified with being will comprehend the other, and so they will be one and not two.
Very true.
But perhaps you mean to give the name of being to both of them together.
Quite likely.
Then, friends, we shall reply to them, the answer is plainly that the two will still be resolved into one.
Most true.
Since then we are in a difficulty, please to tell us what you mean when you speak of being, for there can be no doubt that you always from the first understood your own meaning, whereas we once thought that we understood you, but now we are in a great strait. Please to begin by explaining this matter to us, and let us no longer fancy that we understand you, when we entirely misunderstand you. There will be no impropriety in our demanding an answer to this question, either of the dualists or of the pluralists.
Certainly not.
And what about the assertors of the oneness of the all? Must we not endeavour to ascertain from them what they mean by being?
By all means.
Then let them answer this question. One you say alone is? Yes, they will reply.
True.
And there is something which you call being?
Yes.
And is being the same as one, and do you apply two names to the same thing?
What will be their answer, stranger?
It is clear, Theaetetus, that he who asserts the unity of being will find a difficulty in answering this or any other question.
Why so?
To admit of two names and to affirm that there is nothing but unity is surely ridiculous.
Certainly.
And equally irrational to admit that a name is anything?
How so?
To distinguish the name from the thing implies duality.
Yes.
And yet he who identifies the name with the thing will be compelled to say that it is the name of nothing, or if he says that it is the name of something, even then the name will only be the name of a name and of nothing else.
True.
And the one will turn out to be only one of one, and being absolute unity will represent a mere name.
Certainly.
And would they say that the whole is other than the one that is, or the same with it?
To be sure they would, and they actually say so.
If being is a whole, as Parmenides sings, every way like unto the fullness of a well-rounded sphere, evenly balanced from the centre on every side, and must needs be neither greater nor less in any way, neither on this side nor on that. Then being has a centre and extremes, and having these must also have parts.
True.
Yet that which has parts may have the attribute of unity in all the parts, and in this way being all and a whole may be one.
Certainly.
But that of which this is the condition cannot be absolute unity.
Why not?
Because, according to right reason, that which is truly one must be affirmed to be absolutely indivisible.
Certainly.
But this indivisible, if made up of many parts, will contradict reason.
I understand.
Shall we say that being is one and a whole because it has the attribute of unity? Or shall we say that being is not a whole at all?
That is a hard alternative to offer.
Most true, for being, having in a certain sense the attribute of one, is yet proved not to be the same as one, and the all is therefore more than one.
Yes.
And yet if being be not a whole, through having the attribute of unity, and there be such a thing as an absolute whole, being lacks something of its own nature?
Certainly.
Upon this view again, being having a defect of being will become not being.
True.
And again the all becomes more than one, for being and the whole will each have their separate nature.
Yes.
But if the whole does not exist at all the previous difficulties remain the same, and there will be the further difficulty, that besides having no being, being can never have come into being.
Why so?
Because that which comes into being always comes into being as a whole, so that he who does not give whole a place among beings cannot speak either of essence or generation as existing.
Yes, that certainly appears to be true.
Again, how can that which is not a whole have any quantity? For that which is of a certain quantity must necessarily be the whole of that quantity.
Exactly.
And there will be innumerable other points, each of them causing infinite trouble to him, who says that being is either one or two.
The difficulties which are dawning upon us prove this, for one objection connects with another, and they are always involving what has preceded in a greater and worse perplexity.
We are far from having exhausted the more exact thinkers, who treat of being and not being. But let us be content to leave them, and proceed to view those who speak less precisely, and we shall find as the result of all that the nature of being is quite as difficult to comprehend as that of not being.
Then now we will go to the others.
There appears to be a sort of war of giants and gods going on amongst them. They are fighting with one another about the nature of essence.
How is that?
Some of them are dragging down all things from heaven and from the unseen to earth, and they literally grasp in their hands rocks and oaks. Of these they lay hold, and obstinately maintain, that the things only which can be touched or handled have being or essence, because they define being and body as one. And if anyone else says that what is not a body exists, they altogether despise him, and will hear of nothing but body.
I have often met with such men, and terrible fellows they are.
And that is the reason why their opponents cautiously defend themselves from above, out of an unseen world, mightily contending that true essence consists of certain intelligible and incorporeal ideas. The bodies of the materialists, which by them are maintained to be the very truth, they break up into little bits by their arguments, and affirm them to be not essence, but generation and motion. Between the two armies, Theaetetus, there is always an endless conflict raging concerning these matters.
True.
Let us ask each party in turn to give an account of that which they call essence.
How shall we get it out of them?
With those who make being to consist in ideas there will be less difficulty, for they are civil people enough, but there will be very great difficulty, or rather an absolute impossibility, in getting an opinion out of those who drag everything down to matter. Shall I tell you what we must do?
What?
Let us, if we can, really improve them, but if this is not possible, let us imagine them to be better than they are, and more willing to answer in accordance with the rules of argument, and then their opinion will be more worth having, for that which better men acknowledge has more weight than that which is acknowledged by inferior men. Moreover, we are no respecters of persons, but seekers after truth.
Very good.
Then now, on the supposition that they are improved, let us ask them to state their views, and do you interpret them?
Agreed.
Let them say whether they would admit that there is such a thing as a mortal animal.
Of course they would.
And do they not acknowledge this to be a body having a soul?
Certainly they do.
Meaning to say that the soul is something which exists?
True.
And do they not say that one soul is just and another unjust, and that one soul is wise and another foolish?
Certainly.
And that the just and wise soul becomes just and wise by the possession of justice and wisdom, and the opposite under opposite circumstances?
Yes, they do.
But surely that which may be present or may be absent will be admitted by them to exist.
Certainly.
And allowing that justice, wisdom, the other virtues, and their opposites exist, as well as a soul in which they inhere, do they affirm any of them to be visible and tangible, or are they all invisible?
They would say that hardly any of them are visible.
And would they say that they are corporeal?
They would distinguish. The soul would be said by them to have a body. But as to the other qualities of justice, wisdom, and the like, about which you asked, they would not venture either to deny their existence or to maintain that they were all corporeal.
Verily, Theaetetus, I perceive a great improvement in them. The real aborigines, children of the dragon's teeth, would have been deterred by no shame at all, but would have obstinately asserted that nothing is, which they are not able to squeeze in their hands.
That is pretty much their notion.
Let us push the question, for if they will admit that any, even the smallest particle of being, is incorporeal, it is enough. They must then say what that nature is, which is common to both the corporeal and incorporeal, and which they have in their mind's eye when they say of both of them that they are. Perhaps they may be in a difficulty, and if this is the case, there is a possibility that they may accept a notion of ours respecting the nature of being, having nothing of their own to offer.
What is the notion? Tell me, and we shall soon see.
My notion would be that anything which possesses any sort of power to affect another, or to be affected by another, if only for a single moment, however trifling the cause and however slight the effect, has real existence. And I hold that the definition of being is simply power.
They accept your suggestion, having nothing better of their own to offer.
Very good. Perhaps we, as well as they, may one day change our minds, but for the present, this may be regarded as the understanding which is established with them.
Agreed.
Let us now go to the friends of ideas. Of their opinions, too, you shall be the interpreter.
I will.
To them we say you would distinguish essence from generation.
Yes, they reply.
And you would allow that we participate in generation with the body and through perception, but we participate with the soul through thought in true essence, and essence you would affirm to be always the same and immutable, whereas generation or becoming varies?
Yes, that is what we should affirm.
Well, fair sirs, we say to them, what is this participation which you assert of both? Do you agree with our recent definition?
What definition?
We said that being was an active or passive energy, arising out of a certain power which proceeds from elements meeting with one another. Perhaps your ears, Theaetetus, may fail to catch their answer, which I recognize because I have been accustomed to hear it.
And what is their answer?
They deny the truth of what we were just now saying to the Aborigines about existence.
What was that?
Any power of doing or suffering in a degree, however slight, was held by us to be a sufficient definition of being.
True.
They deny this and say that the power of doing or suffering is confined to becoming, and that neither power is applicable to being.
And is there not some truth in what they say?
Yes, but our reply will be that we want to ascertain from them more distinctly whether they further admit that the soul knows, and that being or essence is known.
There can be no doubt that they say so.
And is knowing and being known doing or suffering, or both? Or is the one doing and the other suffering? Or has neither any share in either?
Clearly neither has any share in either, for if they say anything else, they will contradict themselves.
I understand, but they will allow that if to know is active, then of course to be known is passive. And on this view being, insofar as it is known, is acted upon by knowledge, and is therefore in motion. For that which is in a state of rest cannot be acted upon, as we affirm.
True.
And, O heavens, can we ever be made to believe that motion and life and soul and mind are not present with perfect being? Can we imagine that being is devoid of life and mind, and exists in awful unmeaningness and everlasting fixture?
That would be a dreadful thing to admit, stranger.
But shall we say that has mind and not life?
How is that possible?
Or shall we say that both inhere in perfect being, but that it has no soul which contains them?
And in what other way can it contain them?
Or that being has mind and life and soul, but although endowed with soul remains absolutely unmoved?
All three suppositions appear to me to be irrational.
Under being, then, we must include motion, and that which is moved.
Certainly.
Then, Theaetetus, our inference is that if there is no motion, neither is there any mind anywhere, or about anything or belonging to anyone.
Quite true.
And yet this equally follows if we grant that all things are in motion. Upon this view, too, mind has no existence.
How so?
Do you think that sameness of condition and mode and subject could ever exist without a principle of rest?
Certainly not.
Can you see how without them mind could exist or come into existence anywhere?
No.
And surely contend we must in every possible way against him, who would annihilate knowledge and reason and mind, and yet ventures to speak confidently about anything.
Yes, with all our might.
Then the philosopher who has the truest reverence for these qualities cannot possibly accept the notion of those who say that the whole is at rest, either as unity or in many forms, and he will be utterly deaf to those who assert universal motion. As children say entreatingly, "Give us both," so he will include both the movable and immovable in his definition of being and all.
Most true.
And now do we seem to have gained a fair notion of being?
Yes, truly.
Alas, Theaetetus, methinks that we are now only beginning to see the real difficulty of the inquiry into the nature of it.
What do you mean?
O my friend, do you not see that nothing can exceed our ignorance, and yet we fancy that we are saying something good?
I certainly thought that we were. And I do not at all understand how we never found out our desperate case.
Reflect, after having made these admissions, may we not be justly asked the same questions which we ourselves were asking of those who said that all was hot and cold?
What were they? Will you recall them to my mind?
To be sure I will, and I will remind you of them, by putting the same questions to you which I did to them, and then we shall get on.
True.
Would you not say that rest and motion are in the most entire opposition to one another?
Of course.
And yet you would say that both and either of them equally are?
I should.
And when you admit that both or either of them are, do you mean to say that both or either of them are in motion?
Certainly not.
Or do you wish to imply that they are both at rest when you say that they are?
Of course not.
Then you conceive of being as some third and distinct nature, under which rest and motion are alike included, and observing that they both participate in being, you declare that they are.
Truly we seem to have an intimation that being is some third thing, when we say that rest and motion are.
Then being is not the combination of rest and motion, but something different from them.
So it would appear.
Being then, according to its own nature, is neither in motion nor at rest.
That is very much the truth.
Where then is a man to look for help who would have any clear or fixed notion of being in his mind?
Where indeed?
I scarcely think that he can look anywhere, for that which is not in motion must be at rest, and again, that which is not at rest must be in motion, but being is placed outside of both these classes. Is this possible?
Utterly impossible.
Here then is another thing which we ought to bear in mind.
What?
When we were asked to what we were to assign the appellation of not being, we were in the greatest difficulty. Do you remember?
To be sure.
And are we not now in as great a difficulty about being?
I should say, stranger, that we are in one which is, if possible, even greater.
Then let us acknowledge the difficulty, and as being and not being are involved in the same perplexity, there is hope that when the one appears more or less distinctly, the other will equally appear. And if we are able to see neither, there may still be a chance of steering our way in between them without any great discredit.
Very good.
Let us inquire then how we come to predicate many names of the same thing.
Give an example.
I mean that we speak of man, for example, under many names, that we attribute to him colours and forms and magnitudes and virtues and vices, in all of which instances and in 10,000 others, we not only speak of him as a man but also as good, and having numberless other attributes, and in the same way, anything else which we originally supposed to be one is described by us as many, and under many names.
That is true.
And thus we provide a rich feast for Tyros, whether young or old, for there is nothing easier than to argue that the one cannot be many, or the many one. And great is their delight in denying that a man is good. For man, they insist, is man and good is good. I dare say that you have met with persons who take an interest in such matters. They are often elderly men, whose meagre sense is thrown into amazement by these discoveries of theirs, which they believe to be the height of wisdom.
Certainly I have.
Then, not to exclude anyone who has ever speculated at all upon the nature of being, let us put our questions to them as well as to our former friends.
What questions?
Shall we refuse to attribute being to motion and rest or anything to anything, and assume that they do not mingle and are incapable of participating in one another? Or shall we gather all into one class of things communicable with one another? Or are some things communicable and others not? Which of these alternatives, Theaetetus, will they prefer?
I have nothing to answer on their behalf. Suppose that you take all these hypotheses in turn, and see what are the consequences which follow from each of them.
Very good. And first let us assume them to say that nothing is capable of participating in anything else in any respect. In that case, rest and motion cannot participate in being at all.
They cannot.
But would either of them be if not participating in being?
No.
Then by this admission everything is instantly overturned, as well the doctrine of universal motion as of universal rest, and also the doctrine of those who distribute being into immutable and everlasting kinds. For all these add on a notion of being, some affirming that things are truly in motion, and others that they are truly at rest.
Just so.
Again, those who would at one time compound and at another resolve all things, whether making them into one and out of one creating infinity, or dividing them into finite elements, and forming compounds out of these, whether they suppose the processes of creation to be successive or continuous, would be talking nonsense in all this, if there were no admixture.
True.
Most ridiculous of all will the men themselves be who want to carry out the argument, and yet forbid us to call anything, because participating in some affection from another, by the name of that other.
Why so?
Why, because they are compelled to use the words to be apart from others, in itself, and 10,000 more, which they cannot give up, but must make the connecting links of discourse, and therefore they do not require to be refuted by others, but their enemy, as the saying is, inhabits the same house with them. They are always carrying about with them an adversary, like the wonderful ventriloquist, Eurycles, who out of their own bellies audibly contradicts them.
Precisely so, a very true and exact illustration.
And now, if we suppose that all things have the power of communion with one another, what will follow?
Even I can solve that riddle.
How?
Why, because motion itself would be at rest, and rest again in motion, if they could be attributed to one another.
But this is utterly impossible, and
Of course.
then only the third hypothesis remains.
True.
For surely either all things have communion with all, or nothing with any other thing, or some things communicate with some things, and others not.
Certainly.
And 2 out of these 3 suppositions have been found to be impossible.
Yes.
Every one, then, who desires to answer truly will adopt the third and remaining hypothesis of the communion of some with some.
Quite true.
This communion of some with some may be illustrated by the case of letters, for some letters do not fit each other, while others do.
Of course,
And the vowels especially are a sort of bond which pervades all the other letters, so that without a vowel one consonant cannot be joined to another.
true.
But does everyone know what letters will unite with what, or is art required in order to do so?
Art is required.
What art?
The art of grammar.
And is not this also true of sounds high and low? Is not he who has the art to know what sounds mingle a musician, and he who is ignorant not a musician?
Yes,
And we shall find this to be generally true of art or the absence of art.
of course.
And as classes are admitted by us in like manner to be some of them capable and others incapable of intermixture, must not he who would rightly show what kinds will unite and what will not, proceed by the help of science in the path of argument? And will he not ask if the connecting links are universal, and so capable of intermixture with all things? And again, in divisions, whether there are not other universal classes which make them possible?
To be sure, he will require science, and, if I am not mistaken, the very greatest of all sciences.
How are we to call it? By Zeus, have we not lighted unwittingly upon our free and noble science, and in looking for the Sophist, have we not entertained the philosopher unawares?
What do you mean?
Should we not say that the division according to classes, which neither makes the same other, nor makes other the same, is the business of the dialectical science?
That is what we should say.
Then surely he who can divide rightly is able to see clearly one form pervading a scattered multitude, and many different forms contained under one higher form, and again, one form knit together into a single whole and pervading many such wholes, and many forms, existing only in separation and isolation. This is the knowledge of classes which determines where they can have communion with one another, and where not.
Quite true.
And the art of dialectic would be attributed by you only to the philosopher pure and true.
Who but he can be worthy?
In this region we shall always discover the philosopher if we look for him. Like the Sophist, he is not easily discovered, but for a different reason.
For what reason?
Because the Sophist runs away into the darkness of not being, in which he has learned by habit to feel about, and cannot be discovered because of the darkness of the place. Is not that true?
It seems to be so.
And the philosopher, always holding converse through reason with the idea of being, is also dark from excess of light, for the souls of the many have no eye which can endure the vision of the divine.
Yes, that seems to be quite as true as the other.
Well, the philosopher may hereafter be more fully considered by us, if we are disposed, but the Sophist must clearly not be allowed to escape until we have had a good look at him.
Very good.
Since then we are agreed that some classes have a communion with one another, and others not, and some have communion with a few, and others with many, and that there is no reason why some should not have universal communion with all, let us now pursue the inquiry, as the argument suggests, not in relation to all ideas, lest the multitude of them should confuse us. But let us select a few of those which are reckoned to be the principal ones, and consider their several natures and their capacity of communion with one another, in order that if we are not able to apprehend with perfect clearness the notions of being and not being, we may at least not fall short in the consideration of them, so far as they come within the scope of the present inquiry, if peradventure we may be allowed to assert the reality of not being, and yet escape unscathed.
We must do so.
The most important of all the genera are those which we were just now mentioning, being and rest and motion.
Yes, by far.
And two of these are, as we affirm, incapable of communion with one another.
Quite incapable.
Whereas being surely has communion with both of them, for both of them are.
Of course.
That makes up three of them.
To be sure.
And each of them is other than the remaining two, but the same with itself.
True.
But then what is the meaning of these two words, same and other? Are they two new kinds other than the three, and yet always of necessity intermingling with them? And are we to have 5 kinds instead of 3? Or when we speak of the same and other, are we unconsciously speaking of one of the 3 first kinds?
Very likely we are.
But surely motion and rest are neither the other nor the same.
How is that?
Whatever we attribute to motion and rest in common cannot be either of them.
Why not?
Because motion would be at rest and rest in motion, for either of them, being predicated of both, will compel the other to change into the opposite of its own nature, because partaking of its opposite.
Quite true.
Yet they surely both partake of the same and of the other.
Yes.
Then we must not assert that motion any more than rest is either the same or the other.
No, we must not.
But are we to conceive that being and the same are identical?
Possibly.
But if they are identical, then again in saying that motion and rest have being, we should also be saying that they are the same.
Which surely cannot be.
Then being and the same cannot be one.
Scarcely.
Then we may suppose the same to be a 4th class, which is now to be added to the 3 others.
Quite true.
And shall we call the other a 5th class, or should we consider being and other to be 2 names of the same class?
Very likely.
But you would agree, if I am not mistaken, that existences are relative as well as absolute?
Certainly.
And the other is always relative to other.
True.
But this would not be the case unless being and the other entirely differed. For if the other, like being, were absolute as well as relative, then there would have been a kind of other, which was not other than other. And now we find that what is other must of necessity be what it is in relation to some other.
That is the true state of the case.
Then we must admit the other as the 5th of our selected classes.
Yes.
And the 5th class pervades all classes, for they all differ from one another, not by reason of their own nature, but because they partake of the idea of the other.
Quite true.
Then let us now put the case with reference to each of the 5.
How?
First, there is motion, which we affirm to be absolutely other than rest. What else can we say?
It is so.
And therefore is not rest,
Certainly not.
and yet is because partaking of being.
True.
Again, motion is other than the same,
Just so.
and is therefore not the same, and
It is not.
yet surely motion is the same because all things partake of the same.
Very true.
Then we must admit, and not object to say, that motion is the same and is not the same. For we do not apply the terms same and not the same in the same sense, but we call it the same in relation to itself, because partaking of the same, and not the same because having communion with the other, it is thereby severed from the same and has become not that but other, and is therefore rightly spoken of as not the same.
To be sure.
And if absolute motion in any point of view partook of rest, there would be no absurdity in calling motion stationary.
Quite right. That is, on the supposition that some classes mingle with one another, and others not.
That such a communion of kinds is according to nature, we had already proved before we arrived at this part of our discussion.
Certainly.
Let us proceed then. May we not say that motion is other than the other, having been also proved by us to be other than the same and other than rest?
That is certain.
Then, according to this view, motion is other and also not other.
True.
What is the next step? Shall we say that motion is other than the 3 and not other than the 4th? For we agreed that there are 5 classes about, and in the sphere of which we propose to make inquiry.
Surely we cannot admit that the number is less than it appeared to be just now.
Then we may without fear contend that motion is other than being.
Without the least fear.
The plain result is that motion, since it partakes of being, really is and also is not.
Nothing can be plainer.
Then not being necessarily exists in the case of motion and of every class, for the nature of the other entering into them all makes each of them other than being, and so non-existent, and therefore of all of them in like manner we may truly say that they are not, and again inasmuch as they partake of being, that they are and are existent.
So we may assume.
Every class then has plurality of being and infinity of not being.
So we must infer.
And being itself may be said to be other than the other kinds.
Certainly.
Then we may infer that being is not in respect of as many other things as there are, for not being these it is itself one, and is not the other things, which are infinite in number.
That is not far from the truth.
And we must not quarrel with this result, since it is of the nature of classes to have communion with one another. And if anyone denies our present statement, viz. Ours, that being is not, etc., let him first argue with our former conclusion, i.e. respecting the communion of ideas, and then he may proceed to argue with what follows.
Nothing can be fairer.
Let me ask you to consider a further question.
What question?
When we speak of not being, we speak, I suppose, not of something opposed to being, but only different.
What do you mean?
When we speak of something as not great, does the expression seem to you to imply what is little any more than what is equal?
Certainly not.
The negative particles o and me, when prefixed to words, do not imply opposition, but only difference from the words, or more correctly from the things represented by the words, which follow them.
Quite true.
There is another point to be considered, if you do not object.
What is it?
The nature of the other appears to me to be divided into fractions like knowledge.
How so?
Knowledge, like the other, is one, and yet the various parts of knowledge have each of them their own particular name, and hence there are many arts and kinds of knowledge.
Quite true.
And is not the case the same with the parts of the other, which is also one?
Very likely. But will you tell me how?
There is some part of the other which is opposed to the beautiful.
There is.
Shall we say that this has or has not a name?
It has. For whatever we call not beautiful is other than the beautiful, not than something else.
And now tell me another thing.
What?
Is the not beautiful anything but this? An existence parted off from a certain kind of existence, and again from another point of view opposed to an existing something?
True.
Then the not beautiful turns out to be the opposition of being to being.
Very true.
But upon this view, is the beautiful a more real and the not beautiful a less real existence?
Not at all.
And the not great may be said to exist equally with the great?
Yes.
And in the same way, the just must be placed in the same category with the not just. The one cannot be said to have any more existence than the other.
True.
The same may be said of other things. Seeing that the nature of the other has a real existence, the parts of this nature must equally be supposed to exist.
Of course.
Then, as would appear, the opposition of a part of the other, and of a part of being to one another, is, if I may venture to say so, as truly essence as being itself, and implies not the opposite of being, but only what is other than being.
Beyond question.
What then shall we call it?
Clearly not being. And this is the very nature for which the Sophist compelled us to search.
And has not this, as you were saying, as real an existence as any other class? May I not say with confidence that not being has an assured existence and a nature of its own? Just as the great was found to be great and the beautiful beautiful, and the not great and the not beautiful, in the same manner not being has been found to be and is not being, and is to be reckoned one among the many classes of being. Do you, Theaetetus, still feel any doubt of this?
None whatever.
Do you observe that our skepticism has carried us beyond the range of Parmenides' prohibition?
In what?
We have advanced to a further point and shown him more than he forbade us to investigate.
How is that?
Why, because he says, "Not being never is, and do thou keep thy thoughts from this way of inquiry."
Yes, he says so.
Whereas we have not only proved that things which are not are, but we have shown what form of being not being is. For we have shown that the nature of the other is, and is distributed over all things in their relations to one another, and whatever part of the other is contrasted with being, this is precisely what we have ventured to call not being.
And surely, stranger, we were quite right.
Let not anyone say then that while affirming the opposition of not being to being, we still assert the being of not being, for as to whether there is an opposite of being, to that inquiry we have long said goodbye. It may or may not be, and may or may not be capable of definition. But as touching our present account of not being, let a man either convince us of error, or so long as he cannot, he too must say, as we are saying, that there is a communion of classes, and that being and difference or other traverse all things and mutually interpenetrate, so that the other partakes of being, and by reason of this participation is, and yet is not that of which it partakes. But other and being other than being, it is clearly a necessity that not being should be. And again, being, through partaking of the other, becomes a class other than the remaining classes, and being other than all of them, is not each one of them and is not all the rest, so that undoubtedly there are thousands upon thousands of cases in which being is not, and all other things, whether regarded individually or collectively, in many respects are and in many respects are not.
True.
And he who is skeptical of this contradiction must think how he can find something better to say, or if he sees a puzzle, and his pleasure is to drag words this way and that, the argument will prove to him that he is not making a worthy use of his faculties, for there is no charm in such puzzles, and there is no difficulty in detecting them. But we can tell him of something else, the pursuit of which is noble and also difficult.
What is it?
A thing of which I have already spoken. Letting alone these puzzles as involving no difficulty, he should be able to follow and criticize in detail every argument, and when a man says that the same is in a manner other, or that other is the same, to understand and refute him from his own point of view, and in the same respect in which he asserts either of these affections. But to show that somehow, and in some sense the same is other, or the other same, or the great small, or the like unlike, and to delight in always bringing forward such contradictions is no real refutation, but is clearly the newborn babe of someone who is only beginning to approach the problem of being.
To be sure.
For certainly, my friend, the attempt to separate all existences from one another is a barbarism, and utterly unworthy of an educated or philosophical mind.
Why so?
The attempt at universal separation is the final annihilation of all reasoning, for only by the union of conceptions with one another do we attain to discourse of reason.
True.
And observe that we were only just in time in making a resistance to such separatists, and compelling them to admit that one thing mingles with another.
Why so?
Why, that we might be able to assert discourse to be a kind of being, for if we could not, the worst of all consequences would follow. We should have no philosophy. Moreover, the necessity for determining the nature of discourse presses upon us at this moment. If utterly deprived of it, we could no more hold discourse, and deprived of it we should be, if we admitted that there was no admixture of natures at all.
Very true. But I do not understand why at this moment we must determine the nature of discourse.
Perhaps you will see more clearly by the help of the following explanation.
What explanation?
Not being has been acknowledged by us to be one among many classes diffused over all being.
True.
And thence arises the question whether not being mingles with opinion and language.
How so?
If not being has no part in the proposition, then all things must be true. But if not being has a part, then false opinion and false speech are possible. For to think or to say what is not is falsehood, which thus arises in the region of thought and in speech.
That is quite true.
And where there is falsehood, surely there must be deceit.
Yes.
And if there is deceit, then all things must be full of idols and images and fancies.
To be sure.
Into that region the Sophist, as we said, made his escape, and, when he had got there, denied the very possibility of falsehood. No one, he argued, either conceived or uttered falsehood, inasmuch as not being did not in any way partake of being.
True.
And now not being has been shown to partake of being, and therefore he will not continue fighting in this direction, but he will probably say that some ideas partake of not being, and some not, and that language and opinion are of the non-partaking class, and he will still fight to the death against the existence of the image-making and fantastic art in which we have placed him, because, as he will say, opinion and language do not partake of not being, and unless this participation exists, there can be no such thing as falsehood. And with the view of meeting this evasion, we must begin by inquiring into the nature of language, opinion, and imagination, in order that when we find them we may find also that they have communion with not being, and, having made out the connection of them, may thus prove that falsehood exists. And therein we will imprison the Sophist, if he deserves it, or if not, we will let him go again and look for him in another class.
Certainly, stranger. There appears to be truth in what was said about the Sophist at first, that he was of a class not easily caught, for he seems to have abundance of defences, which he throws up, and which must every one of them be stormed before we can reach the man himself. And even now, we have with difficulty got through his first defence, which is the not being of not being. And lo, here is another. For we have still to show that falsehood exists in the sphere of language and opinion, and there will be another and another line of defence without end.
Anyone, Theaetetus, who is able to advance even a little ought to be of good cheer, for what would he who is dispirited at a little progress do, if he were making none at all, or even undergoing a repulse? Such a faint heart, as the proverb says, will never take a city. But now that we have succeeded thus far, the citadel is ours, and what remains is easier.
Very true.
Then, as I was saying, let us first of all obtain a conception of language and opinion, in order that we may have clearer grounds for determining whether not being has any concern with them, or whether they are both always true and neither of them ever false.
True.
Then now let us speak of names as before we were speaking of ideas and letters, for that is the direction in which the answer may be expected.
And what is the question at issue about names?
The question at issue is whether all names may be connected with one another, or none, or only some of them.
Clearly the last is true.
I understand you to say that words which have a meaning when in sequence may be connected, but that words which have no meaning when in sequence cannot be connected.
What are you saying?
What I thought that you intended when you gave your assent, for there are two sorts of intimation of being which are given by the voice.
What are they?
One of them is called nouns and the other verbs, and
Describe them.
that which denotes action we call a verb.
True.
And the other, which is an articulate mark set on those who do the actions, we call a noun.
Quite true.
A succession of nouns only is not a sentence any more than of verbs without nouns.
I do not understand you.
I see that when you gave your assent you had something else in your mind, but what I intended to say was that a mere succession of nouns or of verbs is not discourse.
What do you mean?
I mean that words like walks, runs, sleeps, or any other words which denote action, however many of them you string together, do not make discourse.
How can they?
Or again, when you say lion, stag, horse, or any other words which denote agents, neither in this way of stringing words together do you attain to discourse, for there is no expression of action or inaction, or of the existence or non-existence indicated by the sounds, until verbs are mingled with nouns. Then the words fit, and the smallest combination of them forms language, and is the simplest and least form of discourse.
Again I ask, what do you mean?
When anyone says a man learns, should you not call this the simplest and least of sentences?
Yes.
Yes, for he now arrives at the point of giving an intimation about something which is, or is becoming, or has become, or will be. And he not only names, but he does something, by connecting verbs with nouns, and therefore we say that he discourses, and to this connection of words we give the name of discourse.
True.
And as there are some things which fit one another, and other things which do not fit, so there are some vocal signs which do, and others which do not, combine and form discourse.
Quite true.
There is another small matter.
What is it?
A sentence must and cannot help having a subject,
True.
and must be of a certain quality.
Certainly.
And now let us mind what we are about.
We must do so.
I will repeat a sentence to you in which a thing and an action are combined by the help of a noun and a verb, and you shall tell me of whom the sentence speaks.
I will to the best of my power.
Theaetetus sits, not a very long sentence. And
Not very.
of whom does the sentence speak and who is the subject? That is what you have to tell.
Of me, I am the subject.
Or this sentence again.
What sentence?
Theaetetus, with whom I am now speaking, is flying.
That also is a sentence which will be admitted by everyone to speak of me and to apply to me.
We agreed that every sentence must necessarily have a certain quality.
Yes.
And what is the quality of each of these two sentences?
The one, as I imagine, is false, and the other true.
The true says what is true about you,
Yes.
and the false says what is other than true,
Yes.
and therefore speaks of things which are not as if they were,
True.
and say that things are real of you which are not. For as we were saying, in regard to each thing or person, there is much that is, and much that is not.
Quite true.
The second of the two sentences which related to you was first of all an example of the shortest form consistent with our definition.
Yes, this was implied in recent admission.
And in the second place, it related to a subject,
Yes,
who must be you and can be nobody else,
unquestionably.
and it would be no sentence at all if there were no subject, for, as we proved, a sentence which has no subject is impossible.
Quite true.
When other, then, is asserted of you as the same and not being as being, such a combination of nouns and verbs is really and truly false discourse.
Most true.
And therefore thought, opinion, and imagination are now proved to exist in our minds both as true and false.
How so?
You will know better if you first gain a knowledge of what they are, and in what they severally differ from one another.
Give me the knowledge which you would wish me to gain.
Are not thought and speech the same, with this exception, that what is called thought is the unuttered conversation of the soul with herself?
Quite true.
But the stream of thought which flows through the lips and is audible is called speech?
True.
And we know that there exists in speech
What exists?
affirmation.
Yes, we know it.
When the affirmation or denial takes place in silence and in the mind only, have you any other name by which to call it but opinion?
There can be no other name.
And when opinion is presented, not simply but in some form of sense, would you not call it imagination?
Certainly.
And seeing that language is true and false, and that thought is the conversation of the soul with herself, and opinion is the end of thinking, and imagination or fantasy is the union of sense and opinion, the inference is that some of them, since they are akin to language, should have an element of falsehood as well as of truth.
Certainly.
Do you perceive, then, that false opinion and speech have been discovered sooner than we expected? For just now we seem to be undertaking a task which would never be accomplished.
I perceive.
Then let us not be discouraged about the future, but now, having made this discovery, let us go back to our previous classification.
What classification?
We divided image-making into two sorts, the one likeness-making, the other imaginative or fantastic.
True.
And we said that we were uncertain in which we should place the sophist,
We did say so.
and our heads began to go round more and more when it was asserted that there is no such thing as an image or idol or appearance, because in no manner or time or place can there ever be such a thing as falsehood.
True.
And now, since there has been shown to be false speech and false opinion, there may be imitations of real existences, and out of this condition of the mind, an art of deception may arise.
Quite possible.
And we have already admitted in what preceded that the sophist was lurking in one of the divisions of the likeness-making art.
Yes.
Let us then renew the attempt, and in dividing any class, always take the part to the right, holding fast to that which holds the sophist, until we have stripped him of all his common properties and reached his difference or peculiar. Then we may exhibit him in his true nature, first to ourselves and then to kindred dialectical spirits.
Very good.
You may remember that all art was originally divided by us into creative and acquisitive,
Yes.
and the sophist was flitting before us in the acquisitive class, in the subdivisions of hunting, contests, merchandise, and the like.
Very true.
But now that the imitative art has enclosed him, it is clear that we must begin by dividing the art of creation, for imitation is a kind of creation, of images, however, as we affirm, and not of real things.
Quite true.
In the first place, there are two kinds of creation.
What are they?
One of them is human and the other divine.
I do not follow.
Every power, as you may remember our saying originally, which causes things to exist, not previously existing, was defined by us as creative.
I remember.
Looking now at the world and all the animals and plants, at things which grow upon the earth from seeds and roots, as well as at inanimate substances which are formed within the earth, fusile or non-fusilely, shall we say that they come into existence, not having existed previously, by the creation of God, or shall we agree with vulgar opinion about them?
What is it?
The opinion that nature brings them into being from some spontaneous and unintelligent cause, or shall we say that they are created by a divine reason and a knowledge which comes from God?
I dare say that, owing to my youth, I may often waver in my view, but now when I look at you and see that you incline to refer them to God, I defer to your authority.
Nobly said Theaetetus, and if I thought that you were one of those who would hereafter change your mind, I would have gently argued with you, and forced you to assent. But as I perceive that you will come of yourself and without any argument of mine to that belief which, as you say, attracts you, I will not forestall the work of time. Let me suppose, then, that things which are said to be made by nature are the work of divine art, and that things which are made by man out of these are works of human art. And so there are two kinds of making and production, the one human and the other divine.
True.
Then now subdivide each of the two sections which we have already.
How do you mean?
I mean to say that you should make a vertical division of production or invention, as you have already made a lateral one.
I have done so.
Then now there are in all four parts or segments, two of them have reference to us and are human, and two of them have reference to the gods and are divine.
True.
And again in the division which was supposed to be made in the other way, one part in each subdivision is the making of the things themselves, but the two remaining parts may be called the making of likenesses. And so the productive art is again divided into two parts.
Tell me the divisions once more.
I suppose that we and the other animals and the elements out of which things are made, fire, water, and the like, are known by us to be each and all the creation and work of God.
True.
And there are images of them which are not them but which correspond to them, and these are also the creation of a wonderful skill.
What are they?
The appearances which spring up of themselves in sleep or by day, such as a shadow when darkness arises in a fire, or the reflection which is produced when the light in bright and smooth objects meets on their surface with an external light, and creates a perception the opposite of our ordinary sight.
Yes, and the images as well as the creation are equally the work of a divine hand.
And what shall we say of human art? Do we not make one house by the art of building, and another by the art of drawing, which is a sort of dream created by man for those who are awake?
Quite true.
And other products of human creation are also twofold and go in pairs. There is the thing with which the art of making the thing is concerned, and the image with which imitation is concerned.
Now I begin to understand and am ready to acknowledge that there are two kinds of production, and each of them twofold. In the lateral division, there is both a divine and a human production. In the vertical, there are realities and a creation of a kind of similitudes.
And let us not forget that of the imitative class, the one part was to have been likeness-making, and the other fantastic, if it could be shown that falsehood is a reality and belongs to the class of real being.
Yes.
And this appeared to be the case, and therefore now, without hesitation, we shall number the different kinds as two.
True.
Then now let us again divide the fantastic art.
Where shall we make the division?
There is one kind which is produced by an instrument, and another in which the creator of the appearance is himself the instrument.
What do you mean?
When anyone makes himself appear like another in his figure or his voice, imitation is the name for this part of the fantastic art.
Yes.
Let this then be named the art of mimicry, and this the province assigned to it. As for the other division, we are weary and will give that up, leaving to someone else the duty of making the class and giving it a suitable name.
Let us do as you say, assign a sphere to the one and leave the other.
There is a further distinction, Theaetetus, which is worthy of our consideration, and for a reason which I will tell you.
Let me hear.
There are some who imitate knowing what they imitate and some who do not know. And what line of distinction can there possibly be greater than that which divides ignorance from knowledge?
There can be no greater.
Was not the sort of imitation of which we spoke just now the imitation of those who know? For he who would imitate you would surely know you and your figure.
Naturally.
And what would you say of the figure or form of justice or of virtue in general? Are we not well aware that many, having no knowledge of either, but only a sort of opinion, do their best to show that this opinion is really entertained by them, by expressing it, as far as they can in word and deed?
Yes, that is very common.
And do they always fail in their attempt to be thought just when they are not? Or is not the very opposite true?
The very opposite.
Such a one, then, should be described as an imitator, to be distinguished from the other, as he who is ignorant is distinguished from him who knows.
True.
Can we find a suitable name for each of them? This is clearly not an easy task, for among the ancients there was some confusion of ideas, which prevented them from attempting to divide genera into species, wherefore there is no great abundance of names. Yet for the sake of distinctness, I will make bold to call the imitation which coexists with opinion, the imitation of appearance, that which coexists with science, a scientific or learned imitation.
Granted.
The former is our present concern, for the sophist was classed with imitators indeed, but not among those who have knowledge.
Very true.
Let us then examine our imitator of appearance and see whether he is sound, like a piece of iron, or whether there is still some crack in him.
Let us examine him.
Indeed, there is a very considerable crack, for if you look, you find that one of the two classes of imitators is a simple creature, who thinks that he knows that which he only fancies. The other sort has knocked about among arguments, until he suspects and fears that he is ignorant of that which to the many he pretends to know.
There are certainly the two kinds which you describe.
Shall we regard one as the simple imitator, the other as the dissembling or ironical imitator?
Very good.
And shall we further speak of this latter class as having one or two divisions?
Answer yourself.
Upon consideration, then, there appear to me to be two. There is the dissembler, who harangues a multitude in public in a long speech, and the dissembler, who in private and in short speeches compels the person who is conversing with him to contradict himself.
What you say is most true.
And who is the maker of the longer speeches? Is he the statesman or the popular orator?
The latter.
And what shall we call the other? Is he the philosopher or the sophist?
The philosopher he cannot be, for upon our view he is ignorant. But since he is an imitator of the wise, he will have a name which is formed by an adaptation of the word sophos. What shall we name him? I am pretty sure that I cannot be mistaken in terming him the true and very sophist.
Shall we bind up his name as we did before, making a chain from one end of his genealogy to the other?
By all means.
He then who traces the pedigree of his art as follows, who belonging to the conscious or dissembling section of the art of causing self-contradiction, is an imitator of appearance, and is separated from the class of fantastic, which is a branch of image-making, into that further division of creation, the juggling of words, a creation human and not divine. Anyone who affirms the real sophist to be of this blood and lineage will say the very truth.
Undoubtedly.
The second section. The Statesman. Persons of the dialogue.
Theodorus.
Socrates.
The Eleatic stranger.
The younger Socrates.
I owe you many thanks indeed, Theodorus, for the acquaintance both of Theaetetus and of the stranger.
And in a little while, Socrates, you will owe me 3 times as many, when they have completed for you the delineation of the statesman and of the philosopher, as well as of the sophist.
Sophist, statesman, philosopher. O my dear Theodorus, do my ears truly witness that this is the estimate formed of them by the great calculator and geometrician?
What do you mean, Socrates?
I mean that you rate them all at the same value, whereas they are really separated by an interval, which no geometrical ratio can express.
By Ammon, the god of Serene, Socrates, that is a very fair hit, and shows that you have not forgotten your geometry. I will retaliate on you at some other time, but I must now ask the stranger, who will not, I hope, tire of his goodness to us, to proceed either with the statesman or with the philosopher, whichever he prefers.
That is my duty, Theodorus. Having begun, I must go on and not leave the work unfinished. But what shall be done with Theaetetus?
In what respect?
Shall we relieve him and take his companion, the young Socrates, instead of him? What do you advise?
Yes, give the other a turn as you propose. The young always do better when they have intervals of rest.
I think, stranger, that both of them may be said to be in some way related to me. For the one, as you affirm, has the cut of my ugly face. Compare Theat. The other is called by my name, and we should always be on the lookout to recognize a kinsman by the style of his conversation. I myself was discoursing with Theaetetus yesterday, and I have just been listening to his answers. My namesake I have not yet examined, but I must. Another time will do for me. Today, let him answer you.
Very good. Young Socrates, do you hear what the elder Socrates is proposing?
I do.
And do you agree to his proposal?
Certainly.
As you do not object, still less can I. After the sophist, then, I think that the statesman naturally follows next in the order of inquiry, and please to say whether he, too, should be ranked among those who have science.
Yes.
Then the sciences must be divided as before.
I dare say.
But yet the division will not be the same.
How then?
They will be divided at some other point.
Yes.
Where shall we discover the path of the statesman? We must find and separate off, and set our seal upon this, and we will set the mark of another class upon all diverging paths. Thus the soul will conceive of all kinds of knowledge under 2 classes.
To find the path is your business, stranger, and not mine.
Yes, Socrates, but the discovery, when once made, must be yours as well as mine.
Very good.
Well, and are not arithmetic and certain other kindred arts merely abstract knowledge, wholly separated from action?
True.
But in the art of carpentering and all other handicrafts, the knowledge of the workman is merged in his work. He not only knows, but he also makes things which previously did not exist.
Certainly.
Then let us divide sciences in general into those which are practical and those which are purely intellectual.
Let us assume these two divisions of science, which is one whole.
And are statesman, king, master, or householder one and the same? Or is there a science or art answering to each of these names? Or rather, allow me to put the matter in another way.
Let me hear.
If anyone who is in a private station has the skill to advise one of the public physicians, must not he also be called a physician?
Yes.
And if anyone who is in a private station is able to advise the ruler of a country, may not he be said to have the knowledge which the ruler himself ought to have?
True.
But surely the science of a true king is royal science,
Yes.
and will not he who possesses this knowledge, whether he happens to be a ruler or a private man, when regarded only in reference to his art, be truly called royal?
He certainly ought to be.
And the householder and master are the same?
Of course.
Again, a large household may be compared to a small state. Will they differ at all as far as government is concerned?
They will not.
Then, returning to the point which we were just now discussing, do we not clearly see that there is one science of all of them, and this science may be called either royal or political or economical? We will not quarrel with anyone about the name, and
Certainly not.
this too is evident that the king cannot do much with his hands, or with his whole body, towards the maintenance of his empire, compared with what he does by the intelligence and strength of his mind.
Clearly not.
Then shall we say that the king has a greater affinity to knowledge than to manual arts and to practical life in general?
Certainly he has.
Then we may put all together as one and the same, statesmanship and the statesman, the kingly science and the king.
Clearly.
And now we shall only be proceeding in due order if we go on to divide the sphere of knowledge.
Very good.
Think whether you can find any joint or parting in knowledge,
Tell me of what sort.
such as this. You may remember that we made an art of calculation,
Yes.
which was unmistakably one of the arts of knowledge,
Certainly.
and to this art of calculation, which discerns the differences of numbers, shall we assign any other function except to pass judgment on their differences?
How could we?
You know that the master builder does not work himself, but is the ruler of workmen.
Yes.
He contributes knowledge, not manual labour,
True.
and may therefore be justly said to share in theoretical science.
Quite true.
But he ought not, like the calculator, to regard his functions as at an end when he has formed a judgment. He must assign to the individual workmen their appropriate task until they have completed the work.
True.
Are not all such sciences, no less than arithmetic and the like, subjects of pure knowledge? And is not the difference between the two classes that the one sort has the power of judging only, and the other of ruling as well?
That is evident.
May we not very properly say that of all knowledge there are two divisions, one which rules and the other which judges?
I should think so.
And when men have anything to do in common, that they should be of one mind is surely a desirable thing.
Very true.
Then while we are at unity among ourselves, we need not mind about the fancies of others?
Certainly not.
And now in which of these divisions shall we place the king? Is he a judge and a kind of spectator? Or shall we assign to him the art of command, for he is a ruler?
The latter, clearly.
Then we must see whether there is any mark of division in the art of command too. I am inclined to think that there is a distinction similar to that of manufacturer and retail dealer, which parts off the king from the herald.
How is this?
Why does not the retailer receive and sell over again the productions of others, which have been sold before?
Certainly he does.
And is not the herald under command, and does he not receive orders, and in his turn give them to others?
Very true.
Then shall we mingle the kingly art in the same class with the art of the herald, the interpreter, the boatswain, the prophet, and the numerous kindred arts which exercise command? Or, as in the preceding comparison we spoke of manufacturers, or sellers for themselves, and of retailers, seeing too that the class of supreme rulers, or rulers for themselves, is almost nameless, shall we make a word following the same analogy, and refer kings to a supreme or ruling for self-science, leaving the rest to receive a name from someone else? For we are seeking the ruler, and our inquiry is not concerned with him who is not a ruler.
Very good.
Thus a very fair distinction has been attained between the man who gives his own commands and him who gives another's. And now, let us see if the supreme power allows of any further division.
By all means.
I think that it does, and please to assist me in making the division.
At what point?
May not all rulers be supposed to command for the sake of producing something?
Certainly.
Nor is there any difficulty in dividing the things produced into two classes.
How would you divide them?
Of the whole class, some have life and some are without life.
True.
And by the help of this distinction we may make, if we please, a subdivision of the section of knowledge which commands.
At what point?
One part may be set over the production of lifeless, the other of living objects, and in this way the whole will be divided.
Certainly.
That division then is complete, and now we may leave one half and take up the other, which may also be divided into two.
Which of the two halves do you mean?
Of course that which exercises command about animals, for surely the royal science is not like that of a master workman, a science presiding over lifeless objects. The king has a nobler function, which is the management and control of living beings.
True.
And the breeding and tending of living beings may be observed to be sometimes a tending of the individual, in other cases a common care of creatures in flocks.
True.
But the statesman is not a tender of individuals, not like the driver or groom of a single ox or horse. He is rather to be compared with the keeper of a drove of horses or oxen.
Yes, I see, thanks to you.
Shall we call this art of tending many animals together, the art of managing a herd, or the art of collective management?
No matter, whichever suggests itself to us in the course of conversation.
Very good, Socrates, and if you continue to be not too particular about names, you will be all the richer in wisdom when you are an old man. And now, as you say, leaving the discussion of the name, can you see a way in which a person, by showing the art of herding to be of two kinds, may cause that which is now sought amongst twice the number of things to be then sought amongst half that number?
I will try. There appears to me to be one management of men and another of beasts.
You have certainly divided them in a most straightforward and manly style, but you have fallen into an error which hereafter I think that we had better avoid.
What is the error?
I think that we had better not cut off a single small portion which is not a species, from many larger portions. The part should be a species. To separate off at once the subject of investigation is a most excellent plan, if only the separation be rightly made. And you were under the impression that you were right, because you saw that you would come to man, and this led you to hasten the steps. But you should not chip off too small a piece, my friend. The safer way is to cut through the middle, which is also the more likely way of finding classes. Attention to this principle makes all the difference in a process of inquiry.
What do you mean, stranger?
I will endeavour to speak more plainly out of love to your good parts, Socrates, and although I cannot at present entirely explain myself, I will try, as we proceed, to make my meaning a little clearer.
What was the error of which, as you say, we were guilty in our recent division?
The error was just as if someone who wanted to divide the human race were to divide them after the fashion which prevails in this part of the world. Here they cut off the Hellenes as one species, and all the other species of mankind, which are innumerable, and have no ties or common language, they include under the single name of barbarians, and because they have one name, they are supposed to be of one species also. Or suppose that in dividing numbers you were to cut off 10,000 from all the rest, and make of it one species, comprehending the rest under another separate name, you might say that here too was a single class, because you had given it a single name, whereas you would make a much better and more equal and logical classification of numbers if you divided them into odd and even, or of the human species if you divided them into male and female, and only separated off Lydians or Phrygians or any other tribe, and arrayed them against the rest of the world, when you could no longer make a division into parts which were also classes.
Very true, but I wish that this distinction between a part and a class could still be made somewhat plainer.
O Socrates, best of men, you are imposing upon me a very difficult task. We have already digressed further from our original intention than we ought, and you would have us wander still further away. But we must now return to our subject, and hereafter, when there is a leisure hour, we will follow up the other track. At the same time, I wish you to guard against imagining that you ever heard me declare—
What?
That a class and a part are distinct.
What did I hear then?
That a class is necessarily a part, but there is no similar necessity that a part should be a class. That is the view which I should always wish you to attribute to me, Socrates.
So be it.
There is another thing which I should like to know.
What is it?
The point at which we digressed, for if I am not mistaken, the exact place was at the question, where you would divide the management of herds. To this you appeared rather too ready to answer that there were two species of animals, man being one and all brutes making up the other.
True.
I thought that in taking away a part you imagined that the remainder formed a class, because you were able to call them by the common name of brutes.
That again is true.
Suppose now, O most courageous of dialecticians, that some wise and understanding creature, such as a crane is reputed to be, were, in imitation of you, to make a similar division, and set up cranes against all other animals to their own special glorification, at the same time jumbling together all the others, including man, under the appellation of brutes. Here would be the sort of error which we must try to avoid.
How can we be safe?
If we do not divide the whole class of animals, we shall be less likely to fall into that error.
We had better not take the whole?
Yes, there lay the source of error in our former division.
How?
You remember how that part of the art of knowledge which was concerned with command had to do with the rearing of living creatures. I mean, with animals in herds.
Yes.
In that case, there was already implied a division of all animals into tame and wild. Those whose nature can be tamed are called tame, and those which cannot be tamed are called wild.
True.
And the political science of which we are in search is and ever was concerned with tame animals, and is also confined to gregarious animals.
Yes.
But then we ought not to divide as we did, taking the whole class at once. Neither let us be in too great haste to arrive quickly at the political science, for this mistake has already brought upon us the misfortune of which the proverb speaks.
What misfortune?
The misfortune of too much haste, which is too little speed.
And all the better, stranger. We got what we deserved.
Very well, let us then begin again and endeavour to divide the collective rearing of animals, for probably the completion of the argument will best show what you are so anxious to know. Tell me then.
What?
Have you ever heard, as you very likely may, for I do not suppose that you ever actually visited them, of the preserves of fishes in the Nile and in the ponds of the Great King? Or you may have seen similar preserves in wells at home?
Yes, to be sure, I have seen them, and I have often heard the others described.
And you may have heard also, and may have been assured by report, although you have not travelled in those regions, of nurseries of geese and cranes in the plains of Thessaly.
Certainly.
I asked you because here is a new division of the management of herds into the management of land and of water herds.
There is.
And do you agree that we ought to divide the collective rearing of herds into two corresponding parts, the one the rearing of water, and the other the rearing of land herds?
Yes.
There is surely no need to ask which of these two contains the royal art, for it is evident to everybody.
Certainly.
Anyone can divide the herds which feed on dry land.
How would you divide them?
I should distinguish between those which fly and those which walk.
Most true.
And where shall we look for the political animal? Might not an idiot, so to speak, know that he is a pedestrian?
Certainly.
The art of managing the walking animal has to be further divided, just as you might halve an even number.
Clearly.
Let me note that here appear in view two ways to that part or class which the argument aims at reaching. The one a speedier way, which cuts off a small portion and leaves a large. The other agrees better with the principle which we were laying down, that as far as we can we should divide in the middle. But it is longer. We can take either of them, whichever we please.
Cannot we have both ways?
Together, what a thing to ask, but if you take them in turn, you clearly may.
Then I should like to have them in turn.
There will be no difficulty, as we are near the end. If we had been at the beginning or in the middle, I should have demurred to your request. But now, in accordance with your desire, let us begin with the longer way. While we are fresh, we shall get on better. And now attend to the division.
Let me hear.
The tame walking herding animals are distributed by nature into two classes.
Upon what principle?
The one grows horns and the other is without horns. And
Clearly.
suppose that you divide the science which manages pedestrian animals into two corresponding parts, and define them. For if you try to invent names for them, you will find the intricacy too great.
How must I speak of them, then?
In this way, let the science of managing pedestrian animals be divided into two parts, and one part assigned to the horned herd, and the other to the herd that has no horns.
All that you say has been abundantly proved, and may therefore be assumed.
The king is clearly the shepherd of a polled herd, who have no horns.
That is evident.
Shall we break up this hornless herd into sections and endeavour to assign to him what is his?
By all means.
Shall we distinguish them by their having or not having cloven feet, or by their mixing or not mixing the breed? You know what I mean.
What?
I mean that horses and asses naturally breed from one another.
Yes.
But the remainder of the hornless herd of tame animals will not mix the breed.
Very true.
And of which has the statesman charge, of the mixed or of the unmixed race?
Clearly, of the unmixed.
I suppose that we must divide this again as before.
We must.
Every tame and herding animal has now been split up, with the exception of 2 species, for I hardly think that dogs should be reckoned among gregarious animals.
Certainly not. But how shall we divide the 2 remaining species?
There is a measure of difference which may be appropriately employed by you and Theaetetus, who are students of geometry.
What is that?
The diameter and again the diameter of a diameter. Compare Meno.
What do you mean?
How does man walk but as a diameter whose power is 2 feet?
Just so.
And the power of the remaining kind, being the power of twice 2 feet, may be said to be the diameter of our diameter.
Certainly, and now I think that I pretty nearly understand you.
In these divisions, Socrates, I descry what would make another famous jest.
What is it?
Human beings have come out in the same class with the freest and airiest of creation, and have been running a race with them.
I remark that very singular coincidence.
And would you not expect the slowest to arrive last?
Indeed I should.
And there is a still more ridiculous consequence, that the king is found running about with the herd and in close competition with the bird-catcher, who of all mankind is most of an adept at the airy life. Plato is here introducing a new subdivision, i.e. that of bipeds, into men and birds. Others, however, refer the passage to the division into quadrupeds and bipeds, making pigs compete with human beings and the pig driver with the king. According to this explanation, we must translate the words above, freest and airiest of creation, worthiest and laziest of creation.
Certainly.
Then here, Socrates, is still clearer evidence of the truth of what was said in the inquiry about the Sophist. Compare Sophist.
What?
That the dialectical method is no respecter of persons, and does not set the great above the small, but always arrives in her own way at the truest result.
Clearly.
And now I will not wait for you to ask, but will of my own accord take you by the shorter road to the definition of a king.
By all means.
I say that we should have begun at first by dividing land animals into biped and quadruped, and since the winged herd, and that alone, comes out in the same class with man, we should divide bipeds into those which have feathers and those which have not. And when they have been divided, and the art of the management of mankind is brought to light, the time will have come to produce our statesman and ruler, and set him like a charioteer in his place, and hand over to him the reins of state, for that too is a vocation which belongs to him.
Very good. You have paid me the debt. I mean that you have completed the argument, and I suppose that you added the digression by way of interest. Compare Republic.
Then now let us go back to the beginning and join the links which together make the definition of the name of the statesman's art.
By all means.
The science of pure knowledge had, as we said originally, a part which was the science of rule or command, and from this was derived another part, which was called command for self, on the analogy of selling for self. An important section of this was the management of living animals, and this again was further limited to the management of them in herds, and again in herds of pedestrian animals. The chief division of the latter was the art of managing pedestrian animals which are without horns. This again has a part which can only be comprehended under one term by joining together 3 names, shepherding purebred animals. The only further subdivision is the art of man-herding. This has to do with bipeds and is what we were seeking after, and have now found, being at once the royal and political.
To be sure.
And do you think, Socrates, that we really have done as you say?
What?
Do you think, I mean, that we have really fulfilled our intention? There has been a sort of discussion, and yet the investigation seems to me not to be perfectly worked out. This is where the inquiry fails.
I do not understand.
I will try to make the thought which is at this moment present in my mind clearer to us both.
Let me hear.
There were many arts of shepherding, and one of them was the political, which had the charge of one particular herd?
Yes.
And this the argument defined to be the art of rearing, not horses or other brutes, but the art of rearing man collectively.
True.
Note, however, a difference which distinguishes the king from all other shepherds.
To what do you refer?
I want to ask, whether any one of the other herdsmen has a rival who professes and claims to share with him in the management of the herd?
What do you mean?
I mean to say that merchants, husbandmen, providers of food, and also training masters and physicians will all contend with the herdsmen of humanity, whom we call statesmen, declaring that they themselves have the care of rearing or managing mankind, and that they rear not only the common herd, but also the rulers themselves.
Are they not right in saying so?
Very likely they may be, and we will consider their claim. But we are certain of this, that no one will raise a similar claim as against the herdsman, who is allowed on all hands to be the sole and only feeder and physician of his herd. He is also their matchmaker and accoucheur. No one else knows that department of science. And he is their merrymaker and musician, as far as their nature is susceptible of such influences, and no one can console and soothe his own herd better than he can, either with the natural tones of his voice or with instruments. And the same may be said of tenders of animals in general.
Very true.
But if this is as you say, can our argument about the king be true and unimpeachable? Were we right in selecting him out of 10,000 other claimants to be the shepherd and rearer of the human flock?
Surely not.
Had we not reason just now to apprehend that although we may have described a sort of royal form, we have not as yet accurately worked out the true image of the statesman, and that we cannot reveal him as he truly is in his own nature, until we have disengaged and separated him from those who hang about him and claim to share in his prerogatives?
Very true.
And that, Socrates, is what we must do if we do not mean to bring disgrace upon the argument at its close.
We must certainly avoid that.
Then let us make a new beginning and travel by a different road.
What road?
I think that we may have a little amusement. There is a famous tale of which a good portion may with advantage be interwoven, and then we may resume our series of divisions and proceed in the old path until we arrive at the desired summit. Shall we do as I say?
By all means.
Listen then to a tale which a child would love to hear, and you are not too old for childish amusement.
Let me hear.
There did really happen and will again happen, like many other events of which ancient tradition has preserved the record, the portent which is traditionally said to have occurred in the quarrel of Atreus and Thyestes. You have heard, no doubt, and remember what they say happened at that time.
I suppose you to mean the token of the birth of the golden lamb.
No, not that, but another part of the story which tells how the sun and the stars once rose in the west and set in the east, and that the god reversed their motion and gave them that which they now have as a testimony to the right of Atreus.
Yes, there is that legend also.
Again, we have been often told of the reign of Kronos.
Yes, very often.
Did you ever hear that the men of former times were earthborn and not begotten of one another?
Yes, that is another old tradition.
All these stories and 10,000 others which are still more wonderful have a common origin. Many of them have been lost in the lapse of ages or are repeated only in a disconnected form. But the origin of them is what no one has told and may as well be told now, for the tale is suited to throw light on the nature of the king.
Very good, and I hope that you will give the whole story and leave out nothing.
Listen then, there is a time when God himself guides and helps to roll the world in its course, and there is a time, on the completion of a certain cycle, when he lets go, and the world being a living creature, and having originally received intelligence from its author and creator, turns about, and by an inherent necessity, revolves in the opposite direction.
Why is that?
Why, because only the most divine things of all remain ever unchanged and the same, and body is not included in this class. Heaven and the universe, as we have termed them, although they have been endowed by the Creator with many glories, partake of a bodily nature, and therefore cannot be entirely free from perturbation. But their motion is, as far as possible, single and in the same place, and of the same kind, and is therefore only subject to a reversal, which is the least alteration possible. For the Lord of all moving things is alone able to move of himself, and to think that he moves them at one time in one direction, and at another time in another, is blasphemy. Hence we must not say that the world is either self-moved always, or all made to go round by God in two opposite courses, or that two gods, having opposite purposes, make it move round. But as I have already said, and this is the only remaining alternative, the world is guided at one time by an external power which is divine and receives fresh life and immortality from the renewing hand of the Creator, and again, when let go, moves spontaneously, being set free at such a time as to have, during infinite cycles of years, a reverse movement. This is due to its perfect balance, to its vast size, and to the fact that it turns on the smallest pivot.
Your account of the world seems to be very reasonable indeed.
Let us now reflect and try to gather from what has been said the nature of the phenomenon which we affirm to be the cause of all these wonders. It is this:
What?
the reversal which takes place from time to time of the motion of the universe.
How is that the cause?
Of all changes of the heavenly motions, we may consider this to be the greatest and most complete,
I should imagine so.
and it may be supposed to result in the greatest changes to the human beings who are the inhabitants of the world at the time.
Such changes would naturally occur.
And animals, as we know, survive with difficulty great and serious changes of many different kinds when they come upon them at once.
Very true.
Hence there necessarily occurs a great destruction of them, which extends also to the life of man. Few survivors of the race are left, and those who remain become the subjects of several novel and remarkable phenomena, and of one in particular, which takes place at the time when the transition is made to the cycle opposite to that in which we are now living.
What is it?
The life of all animals first came to a standstill, and the mortal nature ceased to be or look older, and was then reversed and grew young and delicate. The white locks of the aged darkened again, and the cheeks the bearded man became smooth and recovered their former bloom. The bodies of youths in their prime grew softer and smaller, continually by day and night returning and becoming assimilated to the nature of a newly born child in mind as well as body. In the succeeding stage they wasted away and wholly disappeared. And the bodies of those who died by violence at that time quickly passed through the like changes, and in a few days were no more seen.
Then how, stranger, were the animals created in those days, and in what way were they begotten of one another?
It is evident, Socrates, that there was no such thing in the then order of nature as the procreation of animals from one another. The earth-born race, of which we hear in story, was the one which existed in those days. They rose again from the ground, and of this tradition, which is nowadays often unduly discredited, our ancestors, who were nearest in point of time to the end of the last period and came into being at the beginning of this, are to us the heralds. And mark how consistent the sequel of the tale is. After the return of age to youth follows the return of the dead, who are lying in the earth, to life. Simultaneously with the reversal of the world, the wheel of their generation has been turned back, and they are put together and rise and live in the opposite order, unless God has carried any of them away to some other lot. According to this tradition, they of necessity sprang from the earth and have the name of earthborn, and so the above legend clings to them.
Certainly that is quite consistent with what has preceded. But tell me, was the life which you said existed in the reign of Kronos, in that cycle of the world, or in this? For the change in the course of the stars and the sun must have occurred in both.
I see that you enter into my meaning. Know that blessed and spontaneous life does not belong to the present cycle of the world, but to the previous one, in which God superintended the whole revolution of the universe, and the several parts the universe were distributed under the rule of certain inferior deities, as is the way in some places still. There were demigods, who were the shepherds of the various species and herds of animals, and each one was in all respects sufficient for those of whom he was the shepherd. Neither was there any violence, or devouring of one another, or war or quarrel among them. And I might tell of 10,000 other blessings, which belong to that dispensation. The reason why the life of man was, as tradition says, spontaneous, is as follows. In those days, God himself was their shepherd, and ruled over them, just as man, who is by comparison a divine being, still rules over the lower animals. Under him there were no forms of government or separate possession of women and children, for all men rose again from the earth, having no memory of the past. And although they had nothing of this sort, the earth gave them fruits in abundance which grew on trees and shrubs unbidden, and were not planted by the hand of man. And they dwelt naked, and mostly in the open air, for the temperature of their seasons was mild. And they had no beds, but lay on soft couches of grass, which grew plentifully out of the earth. Such was the life of man in the days of Kronos, Socrates, the character of our present life, which is said to be under Zeus, you know from your own experience. Can you and will you determine which of them you deem the happier?
Impossible.
Then shall I determine for you as well as I can.
By all means.
Suppose that the nurslings of Kronos, having this boundless leisure, and the power of holding intercourse, not only with men, but with the brute creation, had used all these advantages with a view to philosophy, conversing with the brutes as well as with one another, and learning of every nature which was gifted with any special power, and was able to contribute some special experience to the store of wisdom, there would be no difficulty in deciding that they would be 1,000 times happier than the men of our own day. Or again, if they had merely eaten and drunk until they were full, and told stories to one another and to the animals, such stories as are now attributed to them, in this case also, as I should imagine, the answer would be easy. But until some satisfactory witness can be found of the love of that age for knowledge and discussion, we had better let the matter drop, and give the reason why we have unearthed this tale, and then we shall be able to get on. In the fullness of time, when the change was to take place, and the earth-born race had all perished, and every soul had completed its proper cycle of births and been sown in the earth her appointed number of times, the pilot of the universe let the helm go and retired to his place of view, and then fate and innate desire reversed the motion of the world. Then also all the inferior deities who share the rule of the supreme power, being informed of what was happening, let go the parts of the world which were under their control. And the world turning round with a sudden shock, being impelled in an opposite direction from beginning to end, was shaken by a mighty earthquake, which wrought a new destruction of all manner of animals. Afterwards, when sufficient time had elapsed, the tumult and confusion and earthquake ceased, and the universal creature once more at peace attained to a calm and settled down into his own orderly and accustomed course, having the charge and rule of himself and of all the creatures which are contained in him, and executing, as far as he remembered them, the instructions of his Father and Creator, more precisely at first, but afterwards with less exactness. The reason of the falling off was the admixture of matter in him. This was inherent in the primal nature, which was full of disorder until attaining to the present order. From God, the constructor, the world received all that is good in him, but from a previous state came elements of evil and unrighteousness, which thence derived first of all passed into the world, and were then transmitted to the animals. While the world was aided by the pilot in nurturing the animals, the evil was small, and great the good which he produced. But after the separation, when the world was let go, at first all proceeded well enough. But as time went on, there was more and more forgetting, and the old discord again held sway and burst forth in full glory. And at last small was the good, and great was the admixture of evil, and there was a danger of universal ruin to the world, and to the things contained in him. Wherefore God, the orderer of all in his tender care, seeing that the world was in great straits, and fearing that all might be dissolved in the storm and disappear in infinite chaos, again seated himself at the helm, and bringing back the elements which had fallen into dissolution and disorder to the motion which had prevailed under his dispensation, he set them in order, and restored them, and made the world imperishable and immortal. And this is the whole tale, of which the first part will suffice to illustrate the nature of the king. For when the world turned towards the present cycle of generation, the age of man again stood still, and a change opposite to the previous one was the result. The small creatures which had almost disappeared grew in and stature, and the newly born children of the earth became grey, and died, and sank into the earth again. All things changed, imitating and following the condition of the universe, and of necessity agreeing with that in their mode of conception and generation and nurture. For no animal was any longer allowed to come into being in the earth through the agency of other creative beings, but as the world was ordained to be the lord of his own progress, in like manner the parts were ordained to grow and generate and give nourishment, as far as they could, of themselves, impelled by a similar movement. And so we have arrived at the real end of this discourse, for although there might be much to tell of the lower animals, and of the condition out of which they changed, and of the causes of the change, about men there is not much, and that little is more to the purpose. Deprived of the care of God, who had possessed and tended to them, they were left helpless and defenceless, and were torn in pieces by the beasts, who were naturally fierce and had now grown wild. And in the first ages they were still without skill or resource. The food which once grew spontaneously had failed, and as yet they knew not how to procure it, because they had never felt the pressure of necessity. For all these reasons they were in a great strait, wherefore also the gifts spoken of in the old tradition were imparted to man by the gods, together with so much teaching and education as was indispensable. Fire was given to them by Prometheus, the arts by Hephaestus, and his fellow worker Athene, seeds and plants by others. From these is derived all that has helped to frame human life, since the care of the gods, as I was saying, had now failed men, and they had to order their course of life for themselves, and were their own masters, just like the universal creature whom they imitate and follow, ever changing, as he changes, and ever living and growing, at one time in one manner, and at another time in another. Enough of the story, which may be of use in showing us how greatly we erred in the delineation of the king and the statesman in our previous discourse.
What was this great error of which you speak?
There were two, the first a lesser one, the other was an error on a much larger and grander scale.
What do you mean?
I mean to say that when we were asked about a king and statesman of the present cycle and generation, we told of a shepherd of a human flock who belonged to the other cycle, and of one who was a god when he ought to have been a man, and this a great error. Again we declared him to be the ruler of the entire state, without explaining how. This was not the whole truth, nor very intelligible, but still it was true, and therefore the second error was not so great as the first.
Very good.
Before we can expect to have a perfect description of the statesman, we must define the nature of his office.
Certainly.
And the myth was introduced in order to show not only that all others are rivals of the true shepherd who is the object of our search, but in order that we might have a clearer view of him who is alone worthy to receive this appellation, because he alone of shepherds and herdsmen, according to the image which we have employed, has the care of human beings.
Very true.
And I cannot help thinking, Socrates, that the form of the divine shepherd is even higher than that of a king, whereas the statesmen who are now on earth seem to be much more like their subjects in character, and much more nearly to partake of their breeding and education.
Certainly.
Still they must be investigated all the same to see whether, like the divine shepherd, they are above their subjects or on a level with them.
Of course.
To resume, do you remember that we spoke of a command for self exercised over animals, not singly but collectively, which we called the art of rearing a herd?
Yes, I remember.
There somewhere lay our error, for we never included or mentioned the statesman, and we did not observe that he had no place in our nomenclature.
How was that?
All other herdsmen rear their herds, but this is not a suitable term to apply to the statesman. We should use a name which is common to them all.
True, if there be such a name.
Why is not care of herds applicable to all? For this implies no feeding or any special duty. If we say either tending the herds, or managing the herds, or having the care of them, the same word will include all, and then we may wrap up the statesman with the rest as the argument seems to require.
Quite right, but how shall we take the next step in the division?
As before, we divided the art of rearing herds accordingly as they were land or water herds, winged and wingless, mixing or not mixing the breed, horned and hornless, so we may divide by these same differences the tending of herds, comprehending in our definition the kingship of today and the rule of Kronos.
That is clear, but I still ask what is to follow.
If the word had been managing herds instead of feeding or rearing them, no one would have argued that there was no care of men in the case of the politician, although it was justly contended that there was no human art of feeding them which was worthy of the name. Or at least if there were, many a man had a prior and greater right to share in such an art than any king.
True.
But no other art or science will have a prior or better right than the royal science to care for human society and to rule over men in general.
Quite true.
In the next place, Socrates, we must surely notice that a great error was committed at the end of our analysis.
What was it?
Why, supposing we were ever so sure that there is such an art as the art of rearing or feeding bipeds, there was no reason why we should call this the royal or political art, as though there were no more to be said.
Certainly not.
Our first duty, as we were saying, was to remodel the name, so as to have the notion of care rather than of feeding, and then to divide, for there may be still considerable divisions.
How can they be made?
First, by separating the divine shepherd from the human guardian or manager.
True.
And the art of management which is assigned to man would again have to be subdivided.
On what principle?
On the principle of voluntary and compulsory.
Why?
Because, if I am not mistaken, there has been an error here, for our simplicity led us to rank king and tyrant together, whereas they are utterly distinct, like their modes of government.
True.
Then now, as I said, let us make the correction and divide human care into two parts, on the principle of voluntary and compulsory.
Certainly.
And if we call the management of violent rulers tyranny, and the voluntary management of herds of voluntary bipeds politics, may we not further assert that he who has this latter art of management is the true king and statesman?
I think, stranger, that we have now completed the account of the statesman.
Would that we had, Socrates, but I have to satisfy myself as well as you, and in my judgment, the figure of the king is not yet perfected. Like statuaries who, in their too great haste, having overdone the several parts of their work, lose time in cutting them down, so too we, partly out of haste, partly out of a magnanimous desire to expose our former error, and also because we imagined that a king required grand illustrations, have taken up a marvellous lump of fable, and have been obliged to use more than was necessary. This made us discourse at large, and nevertheless the story never came to an end. And our discussion might be compared to a picture of some living being which had been fairly drawn in outline, but had not yet attained the life and clearness which is given by the blending of colours. Now, to intelligent persons, a living being had better be delineated by language and discourse than by any painting or work of art, to the duller sort by works of art.
Very true, but what is the imperfection which still remains? I wish that you would tell me.
The higher ideas, my dear friend, can hardly be set forth except through the medium of examples. Every man seems to know all things in a dreamy sort of way, and then again to wake up and to know nothing.
What do you mean?
I fear that I have been unfortunate in raising a question about our experience of knowledge.
Why so?
Why, because my example requires the assistance of another example.
Proceed. You need not fear that I shall tire.
I will proceed, finding as I do such a ready listener in you, when children are beginning to know their letters.
What are you going to say?
That they distinguish the several letters well enough in very short and easy syllables, and are able to tell them correctly.
Certainly.
Whereas in other syllables they do not recognize them and think and speak falsely of them.
Very true.
Will not the best and easiest way of bringing them to a knowledge of what they do not as yet know be?
Be what?
To refer them first of all to cases in which they judge correctly about the letters in question, and then to compare these with the cases in which they do not as yet know, and to show them that the letters are the same, and have the same character in both combinations, until all cases in which they are right have been placed side by side with all cases in which they are wrong. In this way, they have examples, and are made to learn that each letter in every combination is always the same and not another, and is always called by the same name.
Certainly.
Are not examples formed in this manner? We take a thing and compare it with another distinct instance of the same thing, of which we have a right conception, and out of the comparison there arises one true notion which includes both of them.
Exactly.
Can we wonder, then, that the soul has the same uncertainty about the alphabet of things, and sometimes and in some cases is firmly fixed by the truth in each particular, and then again, in other cases, is altogether at sea, having somehow or other a correct notion of combinations, but when the elements are transferred into the long and difficult language, syllables of facts, is again ignorant of them?
There is nothing wonderful in that.
Could anyone, my friend, who began with false opinion ever expect to arrive even at a small portion of truth and to attain wisdom?
Hardly.
Then you and I will not be far wrong in trying to see the nature of example in general in a small and particular instance. Afterwards, from lesser things we intend to pass to the royal class, which is the highest form of the same nature, and endeavour to discover by rules of art what the management of cities is, and then the dream will become a reality to us.
Very true.
Then once more let us resume the previous argument, and as there were innumerable rivals of the royal race who claimed to have the care of states, let us part them all off, and leave him alone. And, as I was saying, a model or example of this process has first to be framed.
Exactly.
What model is there which is small and yet has any analogy with the political occupation? Suppose, Socrates, that if we have no other example at hand, we choose weaving, or more precisely, weaving of wool. This will be quite enough without taking the whole of weaving to illustrate our meaning.
Certainly.
Why should we not apply to weaving the same processes of division and subdivision which we have already applied to other classes, going once more as rapidly as we can through all the steps until we come to that which is needed for our purpose?
How do you mean?
I shall reply by actually performing the process.
Very good.
All things which we make or acquire are either creative or preventive. Of the preventive class are antidotes, divine and human, and also defences, and defences are either military weapons or protections, and protections are veils and also shields against heat and cold, and shields against heat and cold are shelters and coverings are blankets and garments, and garments are some of them in one piece, and others of them are made in several parts. And of these latter some are stitched, others are fastened and not stitched. And of the not stitched, some are made of the sinews of plants, and some of hair. And of these again, some are cemented with water and earth, and others are fastened together by themselves. And these last defences and coverings which are fastened together by themselves are called clothes, and the art which superintends them we may call, from the nature of the operation, the art of clothing, just as before the art of the statesman was derived from the state. And may we not say that the art of weaving, at least that largest portion of it which was concerned with the making of clothes, differs only in name from this art of clothing, in the same way that, in the previous case, the royal science differed from the political?
Most true.
In the next place, let us make the reflection that the art of weaving clothes, which an incompetent person might fancy to have been sufficiently described, has been separated off from several others which are of the same family, but not from the cooperative arts.
And which are the kindred arts?
I see that I have not taken you with me, so I think that we had better go backwards, starting from the end. We just now parted off from the weaving of clothes, the making of blankets, which differ from each other in that one is put under and the other is put around, and these are what I termed kindred arts.
I understand.
And we have subtracted the manufacture of all articles made of flax and cords, and all that we just now metaphorically termed the sinews of plants, and we have also separated off the process of felting and the putting together of materials by stitching and sewing, of which the most important part is the cobbler's art.
Precisely.
Then we separated off the currier's art, which prepared coverings in entire pieces, and the art of sheltering, and subtracted the various arts of making watertight, which are employed in building, and in general in carpentering and in other crafts, and all such arts as furnish impediments to thieving and acts of violence, and are concerned with making the lids of boxes and the fixing of doors, being divisions of the art of joining. And we also cut off the manufacture of arms, which is a section of the great and manifold art of making defences. And we originally began by parting off the whole of the magic art, which is concerned with antidotes, and have left as would appear the very art of which we were in search, the art of protection against winter cold, which fabricates woolen defences, and has the name of weaving.
Very true.
Yes, my boy, but that is not all, for the first process to which the material is subjected is the opposite of weaving.
How so?
Weaving is a sort of uniting.
Yes.
But the first process is a separation of the clotted and matted fibres.
What do you mean?
I mean the work of the carder's art, for we cannot say that carding is weaving, or that the carder is a weaver.
Certainly not.
Again, if a person were to say that the art of making the warp and the woof was the art of weaving, he would say what was paradoxical and false.
To be sure.
Shall we say that the whole art of the fuller or of the mender has nothing to do with the care and treatment of clothes, or are we to regard all these as arts of weaving?
Certainly not.
And yet surely all these arts will maintain that they are concerned with the treatment and production of clothes. They will dispute the exclusive prerogative of weaving, and though assigning a larger sphere to that, will still reserve a considerable field for themselves.
Very true.
Besides these, there are the arts which make tools and instruments of weaving, and which will claim at least to be cooperative causes in every work of the weaver.
Most true.
Well then, suppose that we define weaving, or rather that part of it which has been selected by us, to be the greatest and noblest of arts which are concerned with woolen garments. Shall we be right? Is not the definition, although true, wanting in clearness and completeness? For do not all those other arts require to be first cleared away?
True.
Then the next thing will be to separate them, in order that the argument may proceed in a regular manner.
By all means.
Let us consider in the first place that there are two kinds of arts entering into everything which we do.
What are they?
The one kind is the conditional or cooperative, the other the principal cause.
What do you mean?
The arts which do not manufacture the actual thing, but which furnish the necessary tools for the manufacture, without which the several arts could not fulfill their appointed work, are cooperative, but those which make the things themselves are causal.
A very reasonable distinction.
Thus the arts which make spindles, combs, and other instruments of the production of clothes may be called cooperative, and those which treat and fabricate the things themselves, causal.
Very true.
The arts of washing and mending and the other preparatory arts which belong to the causal class and form a division of the great art of adornment may be all comprehended under what we call the fuller's art.
Very good.
Carding and spinning threads and all the parts of the process which are concerned with the actual manufacture of a woolen garment form a single art, which is one of those universally acknowledged, the art of working in wool. And
To be sure.
of working in wool again there are two divisions, and both these are parts of two arts at once.
How is that?
Carding and one half of the use of the comb, and the other processes of woolworking which separate the composite, may be classed together as belonging both to the art of woolworking and also to one of the two great arts which are of universal application, the art of composition and the art of division.
Yes.
To the latter belong carding and the other processes of which I was just now speaking. The art of discernment or division in wool and yarn, which is effected in one manner with the comb and in another with the hands, is variously described under all the names which I just now mentioned.
Very true.
Again, let us take some process of woolworking, which is also a portion of the art of composition, and, dismissing the elements of division which we found there, make two halves, one on the principle of composition, and the other on the principle of division.
Let that be done.
And once more, Socrates, we must divide the part which belongs at once both to woolworking and composition, if we are ever to discover satisfactorily the aforesaid art of weaving.
We must.
Yes, certainly. And let us call one part of the art of twisting threads, the other the art of combining them.
Do I understand you, in speaking of twisting, to be referring to manufacture of the warp?
Yes, and of the woof too. How, if not by twisting, is the woof made?
There is no other way.
Then suppose that you define the warp and the woof, for I think that the definition will be of use to you.
How shall I define them?
As thus, a piece of carded wool which is drawn out lengthwise and breadthwise is said to be pulled out.
Yes.
And the wool thus prepared, when twisted by the spindle and made into a firm thread, is called the warp, and the art which regulates these operations, the art of spinning the warp.
True.
And the threads which are more loosely spun, having a softness proportioned to the intertexture of the warp and to the degree of force used in dressing the cloth, the threads which are thus spun are called the woof, and the art which is set over them may be called the art of spinning the woof.
Very true.
And now there can be no mistake about the nature of the part of weaving which we have undertaken to define. For when that part of the art of composition, which is employed in the working of wool, forms a web by the regular intertexture of warp and woof, the entire woven substance is called by us a woolen garment, and the art which presides over this is the art of weaving.
Very true.
But why did we not say at once that weaving is the art of entwining warp and woof, instead of making a long and useless circuit?
I thought, stranger, that there was nothing useless in what was said.
Very likely, but you may not always think so, my sweet friend, and in case any feeling of dissatisfaction should hereafter arise in your mind, as it very well may, let me lay down a principle which will apply to arguments in general.
Proceed.
Let us begin by considering the whole nature of excess and defect, and then we shall have a rational ground on which we may praise or blame too much length or too much shortness in discussions of this kind.
Let us do so.
The points on which I think that we ought to dwell are the following.
What?
Length and shortness, excess and defect, with all of these the art of measurement is conversant.
Yes.
And the art of measurement has to be divided into two parts with a view to our present purpose.
Where would you make the division?
As thus, I would make two parts, one having regard to the relativity of greatness and smallness to each other, and there is another, without which the existence of production would be impossible.
What do you mean?
Do you not think that it is only natural for the greater to be called greater, with reference to the less alone, and the less with reference to the greater alone?
Yes.
Well, but is there not also something exceeding and exceeded by the principle of the mean, both in speech and action? And is not this a reality, and the chief mark of difference between good and bad men?
Plainly.
Then we must suppose that the great and small exist and are discerned in both these ways, and not, as we were saying before, only relatively to one another, but there must also be another comparison of them with the mean or ideal standard. Would you like to hear the reason why?
Certainly.
If we assume the greater to exist only in relation to the less, there will never be any comparison of either with the mean.
True.
And would not this doctrine be the ruin of all the arts and their creations? Would not the art of the statesman and the aforesaid art of weaving disappear? For all these arts are on the watch against excess and defect, not as unrealities but as real evils, which occasion a difficulty in action, and the excellence or beauty of every work of art is due to this observance of measure.
Certainly.
But if the science of the statesman disappears, the search for the royal science will be impossible.
Very true.
Well then, as in the case of the sophist, we extorted the inference that not being had an existence, because here was the point at which the argument eluded our grasp. So in this we must endeavour to show that the greater and less are not only to be measured with one another, but also have to do with the production of the mean. For if this is not admitted, neither a statesman nor any other man of action can be an undisputed master of his science.
Yes, we must certainly do again what we did then.
But this, Socrates, is a greater work than the other, of which we only too well remember the length. I think, however, that we may fairly assume something of this sort.
What?
That we shall some day require this notion of a mean with a view to the demonstration of absolute truth. Meanwhile, the argument that the very existence of the arts must be held to depend on the possibility of measuring more or less, not only with one another, but also with a view to the attainment of the mean, seems to afford a grand support and satisfactory proof of the doctrine which we are maintaining. For if there are arts, there is a standard of measure, and if there is a standard of measure, there are arts. But if either is wanting, there is neither.
True. And what is the next step?
The next step clearly is to divide the art of measurement into two parts, as we have said already, and to place in the one part all the arts which measure number, length, depth, breadth, swiftness with their opposites, and to have another part in which they are measured with the mean and the fit, and the opportune, and the due, and with all those words, in short, which denote a mean or standard removed from the extremes.
Here are two vast divisions, embracing two very different spheres.
There are many accomplished men, Socrates, who say, believing themselves to speak wisely, that the art of measurement is universal, and has to do with all things. And this means what we are now saying, for all things which come within the province of art do certainly in some sense partake of measure. But these persons, because they are not accustomed to distinguish classes according to real forms, jumble together two widely different things, relation to one another, and to a standard under the idea that they are the same, and also fall into the converse error of dividing other things not according to their real parts. Whereas the right way is, if a man has first seen the unity of things, to go on with the inquiry and not desist until he has found all the differences contained in it, which form distinct classes. Nor again should he be able to rest contented with the manifold diversities which are seen in a multitude of things, until he has comprehended all of them that have any affinity within the bounds of one similarity and embraced them within the reality of a single kind. But we have said enough on this head, and also of excess and defect. We have only to bear in mind that two divisions of the art of measurement have been discovered which are concerned with them, and not forget what they are.
We will not forget.
And now that this discussion is completed, let us go on to consider another question, which concerns not this argument only, but the conduct of such arguments in general.
What is this new question?
Take the case of a child who is engaged in learning his letters. When he is asked what letters make up a word, should we say that the question is intended to improve his grammatical knowledge of that particular word, or of all words?
Clearly in order that he may have a better knowledge of all words.
And is our inquiry about the statesman intended only to improve our knowledge of politics, or our power of reasoning generally?
Clearly, as in the former example, the purpose is general.
Still less would any rational man seek to analyze the notion of weaving for its own sake. But people seem to forget that some things have sensible images, which are readily known, and can be easily pointed out when anyone desires to answer an inquirer without any trouble or argument, whereas the greatest and highest truths have no outward image of themselves visible to man, which he who wishes to satisfy the soul of the inquirer can adapt to the eye of sense, compare Phaedra, and therefore we ought to train ourselves to give and accept a rational account of them. For immaterial things, which are the noblest and greatest, are shown only in thought and idea and in no other way, and all that we are now saying is said for the sake of them. Moreover, there is always less difficulty in fixing the mind on small matters than on great.
Very good.
Let us call to mind the bearing of all this.
What is it?
I wanted to get rid of any impression of tediousness which we may have experienced in the discussion about weaving and the reversal of the universe, and in the discussion concerning the sophist and the being of not being. I know that they were felt to be too long, and I reproached myself with this, fearing that they might be not only tedious but irrelevant, and all that I have now said is only designed to prevent the recurrence of any such disagreeables for the future.
Very good. Will you proceed?
Then I would like to observe that you and I, remembering what has been said, should praise or blame the length or shortness of discussions, not by comparing them with one another, but with what is fitting, having regard to the part of measurement which, as we said, was to be borne in mind.
Very true.
And yet not everything is to be judged even with a view to what is fitting, for we should only want such a length as is suited to give pleasure, if at all, as a secondary matter, and reason tells us that we should be contented to make the ease or rapidity of an inquiry, not our first but our second object, the first and highest of all being to assert the great method of division according to species. Whether the discourse be shorter or longer is not to the point. No offence should be taken at length, but the longer and shorter are to be employed indifferently, according as either of them is better calculated to sharpen the wits of the auditors. Reason would also say to him who censures the length of discourses on such occasions, and cannot away with their circumlocution, that he should not be in such a hurry to have done with them, when he can only complain that they are tedious, but he should prove that if they had been shorter, they would have made those who took part in them better dialecticians and more capable of expressing the truth of things. About any other praise and blame, he need not trouble himself, he should pretend not to hear them. But we have had enough of this, as you will probably agree with me in thinking. Let us return to our statesman, and apply to his case the aforesaid example of weaving.
Very good. Let us do as you say.
The art of the king has been separated from the similar arts of shepherds, and indeed from all those which have to do with herds at all. There still remain, however, of the causal and cooperative arts, those which are immediately concerned with states, and which must first be distinguished from one another.
Very good.
You know that these arts cannot easily be divided into two halves. The reason will be very evident as we proceed.
Then we had better do so.
We must carve them like a victim into members or limbs, since we cannot bisect them. Compare Phaedra. For we certainly should divide everything into as few parts as possible.
What is to be done in this case?
What we did in the example of weaving, all those arts which furnish the tools, were regarded by us as cooperative.
Yes.
So now, and with still more reason, all arts which make any implement in a state, whether great or small, may be regarded by us as cooperative, for without them neither state nor statesmanship would be possible, and yet we are not inclined to say that any of them is a product of the kingly art.
No, indeed.
The task of separating this class from others is not an easy one, for there is plausibility in saying that anything in the world is the instrument of doing something. But there is another class of possessions in a city, of which I have a word to say.
What class do you mean?
A class which may be described as not having this power. That is to say, not like an instrument, framed for production, but designed for the preservation of that which is produced.
To what do you refer?
To the class of vessels, as they are comprehensively termed, which are constructed for the preservation of things moist and dry, of things prepared in the fire or out of the fire. This is a very large class, and has, if I am not mistaken, literally nothing to do with the royal art of which we are in search.
Certainly not.
There is also a third class of possessions to be noted, different from these and very extensive, moving or resting on land or water, honourable and also dishonourable. The whole of this class has one name, because it is intended to be sat upon, being always a seat for something.
What is it?
A vehicle which is certainly not the work of the statesman, but of the carpenter, potter, and coppersmith.
I understand.
And is there not a fourth class which is again different, and in which most of the things formerly mentioned are contained? Every kind of dress, most sorts of arms, walls and enclosures, whether of earth or stone, and 10,000 other things. All of which, being made for the sake of defence, may be truly called defences, and are for the most part to be regarded as the work of the builder or of the weaver, rather than of the statesman.
Certainly.
Shall we add a fifth class of ornamentation and drawing, and of the imitations produced by drawing and music, which are designed for amusement only, and may be fairly comprehended under one name?
What is it?
Plaything is the name.
Certainly.
That one name may be fitly predicated of all of them, for none of these things have a serious purpose. Amusement is their sole aim.
That again I understand.
Then there is a class which provides materials for all these, out of which and in which the arts already mentioned fabricate their works. This manifold class, I say, which is the creation and offspring of many other arts, may I not rank sixth?
What do you mean?
I am referring to gold, silver, and other metals, and all that wood-cutting and shearing of every sort provides for the art of carpentry and plating. And there is the process of barking and stripping the cuticle of plants, and the currier's art, which strips off the skins of animals, and other similar arts which manufacture corks and papyri and cords, and provide for the manufacture of composite species out of simple kinds. The whole class may be termed the primitive and simple possession of man, and with this the kingly science has no concern at all.
True.
The provision of food and of all other things which mingle their particles with the particles of the human body and minister to the body will form a seventh class, which may be called by the general term of nourishment, unless you have any better name to offer. This, however, appertains rather to the husbandman, huntsman, trainer, doctor, cook, and is not to be assigned to the statesman's art.
Certainly not.
These 7 classes include nearly every description of property, with the exception of tame animals. Consider, there was the original material, which ought to have been placed first. Next come instruments, vessels, vehicles, defences, playthings, nourishment. Small things which may be included under one of these, as for example coins, seals and stamps, are omitted, for they have not in them the character of any larger kind which includes them, but some of them may, with a little forcing, be placed among ornaments, and others may be made to harmonize with the class of implements. The art of herding, which has been already divided into parts, will include all property in tame animals except slaves.
Very true.
The class of slaves and ministers only remains, and I suspect that in this the real aspirants for the throne, who are the rivals of the king in the formation of the political web, will be discovered, just as spinners, carders, and the rest of them were the rivals of the weaver. All the others, who were termed cooperators, have been got rid of among the occupations already mentioned, and separated from the royal and political science.
I agree.
Let us go a little nearer, in order that we may be more certain of the complexion of this remaining class.
Let us do so.
We shall find from our present point of view that the greatest servants are in a case and condition which is the reverse of what we anticipated.
Who are they?
Those who have been purchased and have so become possessions. These are unmistakably slaves, and certainly do not claim royal science.
Certainly not.
Again, freemen who of their own accord become the servants of the other classes in a state, and who exchange and equalize the products of husbandry and the other arts, some sitting in the marketplace, others going from city to city by land or sea, and giving money in exchange for money or for other productions. The money changer, the merchant, the ship owner, the retailer, will not put in any claim to statecraft or politics.
No, unless indeed to the politics of commerce.
But surely men whom we see acting as hirelings and serfs, and too happy to turn their hand to anything, will not profess to share in royal science.
Certainly not.
But what would you say of some other serviceable officials?
Who are they, and what services do they perform?
There are heralds and scribes perfected by practice, and divers others who have great skill in various sorts of business connected with the government of states. What shall we call them?
They are the officials and servants of the rulers, as you just now called them, but not themselves rulers.
There may be something strange in any servant pretending to be a ruler, and yet I do not think that I could have been dreaming when I imagined that the principal claimants to political science would be found somewhere in this neighborhood.
Very true.
Well, let us draw nearer and try the claims of some who have not yet been tested. In the first place, there are diviners, who have a portion of servile or ministerial science, and are thought to be the interpreters of the gods to men.
True.
There is also the priestly class who, as the law declares, know how to give the gods gifts from men in the form of sacrifices which are acceptable to them, and to ask on our behalf blessings in return from them. Now both these are branches of the servile or ministerial art.
Yes, clearly.
And here I think that we seem to be getting on the right track, for the priest and the diviner are swollen with pride and prerogative, and they create an awful impression of themselves by the magnitude of their enterprises. In Egypt, the king himself is not allowed to reign unless he have priestly powers, and if he should be of another class and has thrust himself in, he must get enrolled in the priesthood. In many parts of Hellas, the duty of offering the most solemn propitiatory sacrifices is assigned to the highest magistracies, and here, at Athens, the most solemn and national of the ancient sacrifices are supposed to be celebrated by him who has been chosen by lot to be the king archon.
Precisely.
But who are these other kings and priests elected by lot who now come into view followed by their retainers and a vast throng as the former class disappears and the scene changes?
Whom can you mean?
They are a strange crew.
Why strange?
A minute ago I thought that they were animals of every tribe, for many of them are like lions and centaurs, and many more like satyrs and such weak and shifty creatures. Protean shapes quickly changing into one another's forms and natures, and now, Socrates, I begin to see who they are.
Who are they? You seem to be gazing on some strange vision.
Yes, everyone looks strange when you do not know him, and just now I myself fell into this mistake. At first sight, coming suddenly upon him, I did not recognize the politician and his troop.
Who is he?
The chief of Sophists and most accomplished of wizards, who must at any cost be separated from the true king or statesman, if we are ever to see daylight in the present inquiry.
That is a hope not lightly to be renounced.
Never if I can help it, and first let me ask you a question.
What?
Is not monarchy a recognized form of government?
Yes.
And after monarchy, next in order comes the government of the few.
Of course.
Is not the third form of government the rule of the multitude, which is called by the name of democracy?
Certainly.
And do not these three expand in a manner into five, producing out of themselves two other names?
What are they?
There is a criterion of voluntary and involuntary poverty and riches, law and the absence of law, which men nowadays apply to them. The two first they subdivide accordingly, and ascribe to monarchy two forms and two corresponding names, royalty and tyranny.
Very true.
And the government of the few they distinguish by the names of aristocracy and oligarchy.
Certainly.
Democracy alone, whether rigidly observing the laws or not, and whether the multitude rule over the men of property with their consent or against their consent, always in ordinary language has the same name.
True.
But do you suppose that any form of government which is defined by these characteristics of the one, the few, or the many, of poverty or wealth, of voluntary or compulsory submission, of written law, or the absence of law, can be a right one?
Why not?
Reflect and follow me.
In what direction?
Shall we abide by what we said at first, or shall we retract our words?
To what do you refer?
If I am not mistaken, we said that royal power was a science?
Yes.
And a science of a peculiar kind which was selected out of the rest as having a character which is at once judicial and authoritative.
Yes.
And there was one kind of authority over lifeless things and another other living animals, and so we proceeded in the division step by step up to this point, not losing the idea of science, but unable as yet to determine the nature of the particular science.
True.
Hence we are led to observe that the distinguishing principle of the state cannot be the few or many, the voluntary or involuntary, poverty or riches. But some notion of science must enter into it, if we are to be consistent with what has preceded.
And we must be consistent.
Well then, in which of these various forms of states may the science of government, which is among the greatest of all sciences and most difficult to acquire, be supposed to reside? That we must discover, and then we shall see who are the false politicians who pretend to be politicians but are not, although they persuade many, and shall separate them from the wise king.
That, as the argument has already intimated, will be our duty.
Do you think that the multitude in a state can attain political science?
Impossible.
But perhaps in a city of 1,000 men there would be 100 or say 50 who could.
In that case, political science would certainly be the easiest of all sciences. There could not be found in a city of that number as many really first-rate draught players, if judged by the standard of the rest of Hellas, and there would certainly not be as many kings. For kings, we may truly call those who possess royal science, whether they rule or not, as was shown in the previous argument.
Thank you for reminding me, and the consequence is that any true form of government can only be supposed to be the government of one, two, or at any rate, of a few.
Certainly.
And these, whether they rule with the will or against the will of their subjects, with written laws or without written laws, and whether they are poor or rich, and whatever be the nature of their rule, must be supposed, according to our present view, to rule on some scientific principle, just as the physician, whether he cures us against our will or with our will, and whatever be his mode of treatment, incision, burning, or the infliction of some other pain, whether he practices out of a book or not out of a book, and whether he be rich or poor, whether he purges or reduces in some other way, or even fattens his patients, is a physician all the same so long as he exercises authority over them according to rules of art, if he only does them good and heals and saves them. And this we lay down to be the only proper test of the art of medicine or of any other art of command.
Quite true.
Then that can be the only true form of government in which the governors are really found to possess science and are not mere pretenders, whether they rule according to law or without law, over willing or unwilling subjects, and are rich or poor themselves. None of these things can with any propriety be included in the notion of the ruler.
True.
And whether with a view to the public good they purge the state by killing some or exiling some, whether they reduce the size of the body corporate by sending out from the hive swarms of citizens, or by introducing persons from without, increase it, while they act according to the rules of wisdom and justice, and use their power with a view to the general security and improvement, the city over which they rule, and which has these characteristics, may be described as the only true state. All other governments are not genuine or real, but only imitations of this, and some of them are better, and some of them are worse. The better are said to be well governed, but they are mere imitations like the others.
I agree, stranger, in the greater part of what you say, but as to their ruling without laws, the expression has a harsh sound.
You have been too quick for me, Socrates. I was just going to ask you whether you objected to any of my statements. And now I see that we shall have to consider this notion of there being good government without laws.
Certainly.
There can be no doubt that legislation is in a manner the business of a king, and yet the best thing of all is not that the law should rule, but that a man should rule supposing him to have wisdom and royal power. Do you see why this is?
Why?
Because the law does not perfectly comprehend what is noblest and most just for all, and therefore cannot enforce what is best. The differences of men and actions, and the endless irregular movements of human things, do not admit of any universal and simple rule, and no art whatsoever can lay down a rule which will last for all time.
Of course not.
But the law is always striving to make one, like an obstinate and ignorant tyrant, who will not allow anything to be done contrary to his appointment, or any question to be asked, not even in sudden changes of circumstances, when something happens to be better than what he commanded for someone.
Certainly, the law treats us all precisely in the manner which you describe.
A perfectly simple principle can never be applied to a state of things, which is the reverse of simple.
True.
Then if the law is not the perfection of right, why are we compelled to make laws at all? The reason of this has next to be investigated.
Certainly.
Let me ask whether you have not meetings for gymnastic contests in your city, such as there are in other cities, at which men compete in running, wrestling, and the like.
Yes, they are very common among us.
And what are the rules which are enforced on their pupils by professional trainers or by others having similar authority? Can you remember?
To what do you refer?
The training masters do not issue minute rules for individuals, or give every individual what is exactly suited to his constitution. They think that they ought to go more roughly to work, and to prescribe generally the regimen which will benefit the majority.
Very true.
And therefore they assign equal amounts of exercise to them all. They send them forth together, and let them rest together from their running, wrestling, or whatever the form of bodily exercise may be.
True.
And now observe that the legislator who has to preside over the herd, and to enforce justice in their dealings with one another, will not be able, in enacting for the general good, to provide exactly what is suitable for each particular case.
He cannot be expected to do so.
He will lay down laws in a general form for the majority, roughly meeting the cases of individuals, and some of them he will deliver in writing, and others will be unwritten, and these last will be traditional customs of the country.
He will be right.
Yes, quite right. For how can he sit at every man's side all through his life, prescribing for him the exact particulars of his duty? Who, Socrates, would be equal to such a task? No one who really had the royal science, if he had been able to do this, would have imposed upon himself the restriction of a written law.
So I should infer from what has now been said.
Or rather, my good friend, from what is going to be said.
And what is that?
Let us put to ourselves the case of a physician or trainer who is about to go into a far country and is expecting to be a long time away from his patients, thinking that his instructions will not be remembered unless they are written down. He will leave notes of them for the use of his pupils or patients.
True.
But what would you say if he came back sooner than he had intended, and, owing to an unexpected change of the winds or other celestial influences, something else happened to be better for them? Would he not venture to suggest this new remedy, although not contemplated in his former prescription? Would he persist in observing the original law, neither himself giving any new commandments, nor the patient daring to do otherwise than was prescribed, under the idea that this course only was healthy and medicinal, all others noxious and heterodox? Viewed in the light of science and true art, would not all such enactments be utterly ridiculous?
Utterly.
And if he who gave laws, written or unwritten, determining what was good or bad, honourable or dishonourable, just or unjust, to the tribes of men who flock together in their several cities and are governed in accordance with them. If, I say, the wise legislator were suddenly to come again, or another like to him, is he to be prohibited from changing them? Would not this prohibition be in reality quite as ridiculous as the other?
Certainly.
Do you know a plausible saying of the common people which is in point?
I do not recall what you mean at the moment.
They say that if anyone knows how the ancient laws may be improved, he must first persuade his own state of the improvement, and then he may legislate, but not otherwise.
And are they not right?
I dare say. But supposing that he does use some gentle violence for their good, what is this violence to be called? Or rather, before you answer, let me ask the same question in reference to our previous instances.
What do you mean?
Suppose that a skillful physician has a patient of whatever sex or age, whom he compels against his will to do something for his good, which is contrary to the written rules. What is this compulsion to be called? Would you ever dream of calling it a violation of the art, or a breach of the laws of health? Nothing could be more unjust than for the patient to whom such violence is applied, to charge the physician who practices the violence with wanting skill or aggravating his disease.
Most true.
In the political art, error is not called disease but evil or disgrace or injustice.
Quite true.
And when the citizen, contrary to law and custom, is compelled to do what is juster and better and nobler than he did before, the last and most absurd thing which he could say about such violence is that he has incurred disgrace or evil or injustice at the hands of those who compelled him.
Very true.
And shall we say that the violence, if exercised by a rich man, is just, and if by a poor man, unjust? May not any man, rich or poor, with or without laws, with the will of the citizens or against the will of the citizens, do what is for their interest? Is not this the true principle of government, according to which the wise and good man will order the affairs of his subjects? As the pilot, by watching continually over the interests of the ship and of the crew, not by laying down rules but by making his art a law, preserves the lives of his fellow sailors, even so, and in the self-same way, may there not be a true form of polity created by those who are able to govern in a similar spirit, and who show a strength of art which is superior to the law? Nor can wise rulers ever err, while they observing the one great rule of distributing justice to the citizens with intelligence and skill, are able to preserve them, and as far as may be to make them better from being worse.
No one can deny what has been now said.
Neither, if you consider, can anyone deny the other statement.
What was it?
We said that no great number of persons, whoever they may be, can attain political knowledge or order a state wisely, but that the true government is to be found in a small body or in an individual, and that other states are but imitations of this, as we said a little while ago, some for the better and some for the worse.
What do you mean? I cannot have understood your previous remark about imitations.
And yet the mere suggestion which I hastily threw out is highly important, even if we leave the question where it is, and do not seek by the discussion of it to expose the error which prevails in this matter.
What do you mean?
The idea which has to be grasped by us is not easy or familiar, but we may attempt to express it thus. Supposing the government of which I have been speaking to be the only true model, then the others must use the written laws of this. In no other way can they be saved. They will have to do what is now generally approved, although not the best thing in the world.
What is this?
No citizen should do anything contrary to the laws, and any infringement of them should be punished with death and the most extreme penalties. And this is very right and good when regarded as the second best thing, if you set aside the first of which I was just now speaking. Shall I explain the nature of what I call the second best?
By all means.
I must again have recourse to my favourite images. Through them, and them alone, can I describe kings and rulers.
What images?
The noble pilot and the wise physician who is worth many another man. In the similitude of these, let us endeavour to discover some image of the king.
What sort of an image?
Well, such as this. Every man will reflect that he suffers strange things at the hands of both of them. The physician saves any whom he wishes to save, and any whom he wishes to maltreat, he maltreats, cutting or burning them, and at the same time requiring them to bring him payments, which are a sort of tribute, of which little or nothing is spent upon the sick man, and the greater part is consumed by him and his domestics. And the finale is that he receives money from the relations of the sick man, or from some enemy of his, and puts him out of the way. and the pilots of ships are guilty of numberless evil deeds of the same kind. They intentionally play false and leave you ashore when the hour of sailing arrives, or they cause mishaps at sea and cast away their freight, and are guilty of other rogueries. Now suppose that we, bearing all this in mind, were to determine, after consideration, that neither of these arts shall any longer be allowed to exercise absolute control, either over freemen or over slaves, but that we will summon an assembly either of all the people or of the rich only, that anybody who likes, whatever may be his calling, or even if he have no calling, may offer an opinion either about seamanship or about diseases, whether as to the manner in which physic or surgical instruments are to be applied to the patient, or again about the vessels and the nautical implements which are required in navigation, and how to meet the dangers of winds and waves which are incidental to the voyage, how to behave when encountering pirates, and what is to be done with the old-fashioned galleys, if they have to fight with others of a similar build, and that, whatever shall be decreed by the multitude on these points, upon the advice of persons skilled or unskilled, shall be written down on triangular tablets and columns, or enacted although unwritten to be national customs, and that in all future time vessels shall be navigated and remedies administered to the patient after this fashion.
What a strange notion.
Suppose further that the pilots and physicians are appointed annually, either out of the rich or out of the whole people, and that they are elected by lot, and that after their election they navigate vessels and heal the sick according to the written rules.
Worse and worse.
But hear what follows. When the year of office has expired, the pilot or physician has to come before a court of review, in which the judges are either selected from the wealthy classes or chosen by lot out of the whole people. And anybody who pleases may be their accuser, and may lay to their charge, that during the past year they have not navigated their vessels or healed their patients according to the letter of the law and the ancient customs of their ancestors. And if either of them is condemned, some of the judges must fix what he is to suffer or pay.
He who is willing to take a command under such conditions deserves to suffer any penalty.
Yet once more we shall have to enact that if anyone is detected inquiring into piloting and navigation, or into health and the true nature of medicine, or about the winds or other conditions of the atmosphere, contrary to the written rules, and has any ingenious notions about such matters, he is not to be called a pilot or physician, but a cloudy, prating sophist. Further, on the ground that he is a corrupter of the young, who would persuade them to follow the art of medicine or piloting in an unlawful manner, and to exercise an arbitrary rule over their patients or ships. Anyone who is qualified by law may inform against him and indict him in some court. And then if he is found to be persuading any, whether young or old, to act contrary to the written law, he is to be punished with the utmost rigour, for no one should presume to be wiser than the laws. And as touching healing and health and piloting and navigation, the nature of them is known to all, for anybody may learn the written laws and the national customs. If such were the mode of procedure, Socrates, about these sciences and about generalship, and any branch of hunting or about painting or imitation in general, or carpentry, or any sort of handicraft or husbandry, or planting, or if we were to see an art of rearing horses, or tending herds, or divination, or any ministerial service or draught playing, or any science conversant with number, whether simple or square or cube, or comprising motion. I say, if all these things were done in this way according to written regulations, and not according to art, what would be the result?
All the arts would utterly perish and could never be recovered, because inquiry would be unlawful. And human life, which is bad enough already, would then become utterly unendurable.
But what if, while compelling all these operations to be regulated by written law, we were to appoint as the guardian of the laws someone elected by a show of hands, or by lot, and he, caring nothing about the laws, were to act contrary to them from motives of interest or favour and without knowledge? Would not this be a still worse evil than the former?
Very true.
To go against the laws which are based upon long experience and the wisdom of counsellors who have graciously recommended them and persuaded the multitude to pass them, would be a far greater and more ruinous error than any adherence to written law.
Certainly.
Therefore, as there is a danger of this, the next best thing in legislating is not to allow either the individual or the multitude to break the law in any respect whatever.
True.
The laws would be copies of the true particulars of action, as far as they admit of being written down from the lips of those who have knowledge.
Certainly they would.
And as we were saying, he who has knowledge and is a true statesman will do many things within his own sphere of action by his art, without regard to the laws, when he is of opinion that something other than that which he has written down and enjoined to be observed during his absence would be better.
Yes, we said so.
And any individual or any number of men having fixed laws, in acting contrary to them with a view to something better, would only be acting, as far as they are able, like the true statesman.
Certainly.
If they had no knowledge of what they were doing, they would imitate the truth, and they would always imitate ill. But if they had knowledge, the imitation would be the perfect truth, and an imitation no longer.
Quite true.
And the principle that no great number of men are able to acquire a knowledge of any art has been already admitted by us.
Yes, it has.
Then the royal or political art, if there be such an art, will never be attained either by the wealthy or by the other mob.
Impossible.
Then the nearest approach which these lower forms of government can ever make to the true government of the one scientific ruler is to do nothing contrary to their own written laws and national customs.
Very good.
When the rich imitate the true form, such a government is called aristocracy, and when they are regardless of the laws, oligarchy.
True.
Or again, when an individual rules according to law in imitation of him who knows, we call him a king. And if he rules according to law, we give him the same name, whether he rules with opinion or with knowledge.
To be sure.
And when an individual truly possessing knowledge rules, his name will surely be the same. He will be called a king, and thus the 5 names of governments, as they are now reckoned, become one.
That is true.
And when an individual ruler governs neither by law nor by custom, but following in the steps of the true man of science, pretends that he can only act for the best by violating the laws, while in reality appetite and ignorance are the motives of the imitation, may not such an one be called a tyrant?
Certainly.
And this we believe to be the origin of the tyrant and the king, of oligarchies and aristocracies and democracies, because men are offended at the one monarch, and can never be made to believe that anyone can be worthy of such authority, or is able and willing in the spirit of virtue and knowledge to act justly and holily to all. They fancy that he will be a despot, who will wrong and harm and slay whom he pleases of us. For if there could be such a despot as we describe, they would acknowledge that we ought to be too glad to have him, and that he alone would be the happy ruler of a true and perfect state.
To be sure.
But then, as the state is not like a beehive and has no natural head who is at once recognized to be the superior both in body and in mind, mankind are obliged to meet and make laws, and endeavor to approach as nearly as they can to the true form of government.
True.
And when the foundation of politics is in the letter only and in custom, and knowledge is divorced from action, can we wonder, Socrates, at the miseries which there are, and always will be, in states? Any other art built on such a foundation and thus conducted would ruin all that it touched. Ought we not rather to wonder at the natural strength of the political bond? For states have endured all this, time out of mind, and yet some of them still remain and are not overthrown, though many of them, like ships at sea, founder from time to time, and perish and have perished and will hereafter perish, through the badness of their pilots and crews, who have the worst sort of ignorance of the highest truths. I mean to say that they are wholly unacquainted with politics, of which, above all other sciences, they believe themselves to have acquired the most perfect knowledge.
Very true.
Then the question arises, which of these untrue forms of government is the least oppressive to their subjects, though they are all oppressive, and which is the worst of them? Here is a consideration which is beside our present purpose, and yet having regard to the whole it seems to influence all our actions. We must examine it.
Yes, we must.
You may say that of the 3 forms the same is at once the hardest and the easiest.
What do you mean?
I am speaking of the 3 forms of government which I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion: monarchy, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many.
True.
If we divide each of these, we shall have 6, from which the true one may be distinguished as a 7th.
How would you make the division?
Monarchy divides into royalty and tyranny, the rule of the few into aristocracy, which has an auspicious name, and oligarchy, and democracy, or the rule of the many, which before was one, must now be divided.
On what principle of division?
On the same principle as before, although the name is now discovered to have a 2-fold meaning, for the distinction of ruling with law or without law applies to this as well as to the rest.
Yes.
The division made no difference when we were looking for the perfect state, as we showed before. But now that this has been separated off, and, as we said, the others alone are left for us, the principle of law and the absence of law will bisect them all.
That would seem to follow, from what has been said.
Then monarchy, when bound by good prescriptions or laws, is the best of all the six, and when lawless is the most bitter and oppressive to the subject.
True.
The government of the few, which is intermediate between that of the one and many, is also intermediate in good and evil, but the government of the many is in every respect weak and unable to do either any great good or any great evil, when compared with the others, because the offices are too minutely subdivided, and too many hold them. And this therefore is the worst of all lawful governments, and the best of all lawless ones. If they are all without the restraints of law, democracy is the form in which to live is best. If they are well ordered, then this is the last which you should choose, as royalty, the first form, is the best, with the exception of the seventh, for that excels them all and is among states what God is among men.
You are quite right, and we should choose that above all.
The members of all these states, with the exception of the one which has knowledge, may be set aside as being not statesmen but partisans, upholders of the most monstrous idols, and themselves idols, and being the greatest imitators and magicians, they are also the greatest of sophists.
The name of sophist, after many windings in the argument, appears to have been most justly fixed upon the politicians, as they are termed.
And so our satiric drama has been played out, and the troop of centaurs and satyrs, however unwilling to leave the stage, have at last been separated from the political science.
So I perceive.
There remain, however, natures still more troublesome, because they are more nearly akin to the king, and more difficult to discern. The examination of them may be compared to the process of refining gold.
What is your meaning?
The workmen begin by sifting away the earth and stones and the like. There remain in a confused mass the valuable elements akin to gold, which can only be separated by fire, copper, silver, and other precious metal. These are at last refined away by the use of tests, until the gold is left quite pure.
Yes, that is the way in which these things are said to be done.
In like manner, all alien and uncongenial matter has been separated from political science, and what is precious and of a kindred nature has been left. There remain the nobler arts of the general and the judge, and the higher sort of oratory which is an ally of the royal art, and persuades men to do justice, and assists in guiding the helm of states. How can we best clear away all these, leaving him whom we seek alone and unalloyed?
That is obviously what has in some way to be attempted.
If the attempt is all that is wanting, he shall certainly be brought to light, and I think that the illustration of music may assist in exhibiting him. Please to answer me a question.
What question?
There is such a thing as learning music or handicraft arts in general?
There is.
And is there any higher art or science having power to decide which of these arts are and are not to be learned? What do you say?
I should answer that there is.
And do we acknowledge this science to be different from the others?
Yes.
And ought the other sciences to be superior to this, or no single science to any other? Or ought this science to be the overseer and governor of all the others?
The latter.
You mean to say that the science which judges whether we ought to learn or not must be superior to the science which is learned or which teaches?
Far superior.
And the science which determines whether we ought to persuade or not must be superior to the science which is able to persuade?
Of course.
Very good. And to what science do we assign the power of persuading a multitude by a pleasing tale and not by teaching?
That power, I think, must clearly be assigned to rhetoric.
And to what science do we give the power of determining whether we are to employ persuasion or force towards anyone, or to refrain altogether?
To that science which governs the arts of speech and persuasion.
Which, if I am not mistaken, will be politics.
Very good.
Rhetoric seems to be quickly distinguished from politics, being a different species, yet ministering to it.
Yes.
But what would you think of another sort of power or science?
What science?
The science which has to do with military operations against our enemies. Is that to be regarded as a science or not?
How can generalship and military tactics be regarded as other than a science?
And is the art which is able and knows how to advise when we are to go to war or to make peace the same as this or different?
If we are to be consistent, we must say different.
And we must also suppose that this rules the other, if we are not to give up our former notion.
True.
And considering how great and terrible the whole art of war is, can we imagine any which is superior to it but the truly royal?
No other.
The art of the general is only ministerial and therefore not political.
Exactly.
Once more let us consider the nature of the righteous judge.
Very good.
Does he do anything but decide the dealings of men with one another to be just or unjust in accordance with the standard which he receives from the king and legislator, showing his own peculiar virtue only in this, that he is not perverted by gifts or fears or pity, or by any sort of favour or enmity, into deciding the suits of men with one another contrary to the appointment of the legislator?
No, his office is such as you describe.
Then the inference is that the power of the judge is not royal, but only the power of a guardian of the law which ministers to the royal power.
True.
The review of all these sciences shows that none of them is political or royal, for the truly royal ought not itself to act, but to rule over those who are able to act. The king ought to know what is and what is not a fitting opportunity for taking the initiative in matters of the greatest importance, whilst others should execute his orders.
True.
And therefore the arts which we have described as they have no authority over themselves or one another, but are each of them concerned with some special action of their own, have, as they ought to have, special names corresponding to their several actions.
I agree.
And the science which is over them all and has charge of the laws and of all matters affecting the state, and truly weaves them all into one, if we would describe under a name characteristic of their common nature, most truly we may call politics.
Exactly so.
Then, now that we have discovered the various classes in a state, shall I analyze politics after the pattern which weaving supplied?
I greatly wish that you would.
Then I must describe the nature of the royal web and show how the various threads are woven into one piece.
Clearly.
A task has to be accomplished which, although difficult, appears to be necessary.
Certainly the attempt must be made.
To assume that one part of virtue differs in kind from another is a position easily assailable by contentious disputants who appeal to popular opinion.
I do not understand.
Let me put the matter in another way. I suppose that you would consider courage to be a part of virtue.
Certainly I should.
And you would think temperance to be different from courage, and likewise to be a part of virtue.
True.
I shall venture to put forward a strange theory about them.
What is it?
That they are two principles which thoroughly hate one another and are antagonistic throughout a great part of nature.
How singular?
Yes, very, for all the parts of virtue are commonly said to be friendly to one another.
Yes.
Then let us carefully investigate whether this is universally true, or whether there are not parts of virtue which are at war with their kindred in some respect.
Tell me how we shall consider that question.
We must extend our inquiry to all those things which we consider beautiful and at the same time place in two opposite classes.
Explain. What are they?
Acuteness and quickness, whether in body or soul or in the movement of sound, and the imitations of them which painting and music supply, you must have praised yourself before now, or been present when others praised them.
Certainly.
And do you remember the terms in which they are praised? And
I do not.
I wonder whether I can explain to you in words the thought which is passing in my mind.
Why not?
You fancy that this is all so easy. Well, let us consider these notions with reference to the opposite classes of action under which they fall. When we praise quickness and energy and acuteness, whether of mind or body or sound, we express our praise of the quality which we admire by one word, and that one word is manliness or courage.
How?
We speak of an action as energetic and brave, quick and manly and vigorous too, and when we apply the name of which I speak as the common attribute of all these natures, we certainly praise them.
True.
And do we not often praise the quiet strain of action also?
To be sure.
And do we not then say the opposite of what we said of the other?
How do you mean?
We exclaim how calm, how temperate. In admiration of the slow and quiet working of the intellect, and of steadiness and gentleness in action, of smoothness and depth of voice, and of all rhythmical movement and of music in general, when these have a proper solemnity. Of all such actions we predicate not courage, but a name indicative of order.
Very true.
But when, on the other hand, either of these is out of place, the names of either are changed into terms of censure.
How so?
Too great sharpness or quickness or hardness is termed violence or madness. Too great slowness or gentleness is called cowardice or sluggishness. And we may observe that for the most part these qualities, and the temperance and manliness of the opposite characters, are arrayed as enemies on opposite sides, and do not mingle with one another in their respective actions. And if we pursue the inquiry, we shall find that men who have these different qualities of mind differ from one another.
In what respect?
In respect of all the qualities which I mentioned, and very likely of many others. According to their respective affinities to either class of actions, they distribute praise and blame. Praise to the actions which are akin to their own, blame to those of the opposite party, and out of this many quarrels and occasions of quarrel arise among them.
True.
Stranger. The difference between the two classes is often a trivial concern, but in a state, and when affecting really important matters, becomes of all disorders the most hateful.
To what do you refer?
To nothing short of the whole regulation of human life. For the orderly class are always ready to lead a peaceful life, quietly doing their own business. This is their manner of behaving with all men at home, and they are equally ready to find some way of keeping the peace with foreign states. And on account of this fondness of theirs for peace, which is often out of season where their influence prevails, they become by degrees unwarlike and bring up their young men to be like themselves. They are at the mercy of their enemies, whence in a few years they and their children and the whole city often pass imperceptibly from the condition of freemen into that of slaves.
What a cruel fate.
And now think of what happens with the more courageous natures. Are they not always inciting their country to go to war, owing to their excessive love of the military life? They raise up enemies against themselves, many and mighty, and either utterly ruin their native land or enslave and subject it to its foes.
That again is true.
Must we not admit then that where these two classes exist, they always feel the greatest antipathy and antagonism towards one another?
We cannot deny it.
And returning to the inquiry with which we began, have we not found that considerable portions of virtue are at variance with one another, and give rise to a similar opposition in the characters who are endowed with them?
True.
Let us consider a further point.
What is it?
I want to know whether any constructive art will make any, even the most trivial thing, out of bad and good materials indifferently, if this can be helped. Does not all art rather reject the bad as far as possible, and accept the good and fit materials? And from these elements, whether like or unlike, gathering them all into one, work out some nature or idea?
To be sure.
Then the true and natural art of statesmanship will never allow any state to be formed by a combination of good and bad men, if this can be avoided, but will begin by testing human natures in play, and after testing them, will entrust them to proper teachers who are the ministers of her purposes. She will herself give orders and maintain authority, just as the art of weaving continually gives orders and maintains authority over the carders and all the others who prepare the material for the work, commanding the subsidiary arts to execute the works which she deems necessary for making the web.
Quite true.
In like manner, the royal science appears to me to be the mistress of all lawful educators and instructors, and having this queenly power, will not permit them to train men in what will produce characters unsuited to the political constitution which she desires to create, but only in what will produce such as are suitable. Those which have no share of manliness and temperance, or any other virtuous inclination, and, from the necessity of an evil nature, are violently carried away to godlessness and insolence and injustice, she gets rid of by death and exile, and punishes them with the greatest of disgraces.
That is commonly said.
But those who are wallowing in ignorance and baseness she bows under the yoke of slavery.
Quite right.
The rest of the citizens, out of whom, if they have education, something noble may be made, and who are capable of being united by the statesman, the kingly art blends and weaves together, taking on the one hand those whose natures tend rather to courage, which is the stronger element and may be regarded as the warp, and on the other hand those which incline to order and gentleness, and which are represented in the figure as spun thick and soft, after the manner of the woof. These which are naturally opposed she seeks to bind and weave together in the following manner.
In what manner?
First of all, she takes the eternal element of the soul and binds it with a divine cord, to which it is akin, and then the animal nature, and binds that with human cords.
I do not understand what you mean.
The meaning is that the opinion about the honourable and the just and good and their opposites, which is true and confirmed by reason, is a divine principle, and when implanted in the soul, is implanted, as I maintain, in a nature of heavenly birth.
Yes, what else should it be?
Only the statesman and the good legislator, having the inspiration of the royal muse, can implant this opinion, and he, only in the rightly educated, whom we were just now describing.
Likely enough.
But him who cannot we will not designate by any of the names which are the subject of the present inquiry.
Very right.
The courageous soul, when attaining this truth, becomes civilized, and rendered more capable of partaking of justice, but when not partaking, is inclined to brutality. Is not that true?
Certainly.
And again, the peaceful and orderly nature, if sharing in these opinions, becomes temperate and wise, as far as this may be in a state, but if not, deservedly obtains the ignominious name of silliness.
Quite true.
Can we say that such a connection as this will lastingly unite the evil with one another, or with the good, or that any science would seriously think of using a bond of this kind to join such materials?
Impossible.
But in those who were originally of a noble nature, and who have been nurtured in noble ways, and in those only, may we not say that union is implanted by law, and that this is the medicine which art prescribes for them? And of all the bonds which unite the dissimilar and contrary parts of virtue, is not this, as I was saying, the divinest?
Very true.
Where this divine bond exists, there is no difficulty in imagining, or when you have imagined, in creating the other bonds, which are human only.
How is that? And what bonds do you mean?
Rights of intermarriage and ties which are formed between states by giving and taking children in marriage, or between individuals by private betrothals and espousals. For most persons, form marriage connections without due regard to what is best for the procreation of children.
In what way?
They seek after wealth and power which in matrimony are objects not worthy even of a serious censure.
There is no need to consider them at all.
More reason is there to consider the practice of those who make family their chief aim and to indicate their error.
Quite true.
They act on no true principle at all. They seek their ease and receive with open arms those who are like themselves, and hate those who are unlike them, being too much influenced by feelings of dislike.
How so?
The quiet, orderly class seek for natures like their own, and as far as they can they marry and give in marriage exclusively in this class, and the courageous do the same. They seek natures like their own, whereas they should both do precisely the opposite.
How and why is that?
Because courage, when untempered by the gentler nature during many generations, may at first bloom and strengthen, but at last bursts forth into downright madness.
Like enough.
And then again the soul which is overfull of modesty and has no element of courage in many successive generations is apt to grow too indolent and at last to become utterly paralyzed and useless.
That, again, is quite likely.
It was of these bonds I said that there would be no difficulty in creating them, if only both classes originally held the same opinion about the honourable and good. Indeed, in this single work, the whole process of royal weaving is comprised, never to allow temperate natures to be separated from the brave, but to weave them together, like the warp and the woof, by common sentiments and honours and reputation, and by the giving of pledges to one another, and out of them forming one smooth and even web, to entrust to them the offices of state.
How do you mean?
Where one officer only is needed, you must choose a ruler who has both these qualities. When many, you must mingle some of each, for the temperate ruler is very careful and just and safe, but is wanting in thoroughness and go.
Certainly, that is very true.
The character of the courageous, on the other hand, falls short of the former in justice and caution, but has the power of action in a remarkable degree, and where either of these two qualities is wanting, their cities cannot altogether prosper either in their public or private life.
Certainly they cannot.
This then we declare to be the completion of the web of political action, which is created by a direct intertexture of the brave and temperate natures, whenever the royal science has drawn the two minds into communion with one another by unanimity and friendship, and having perfected the noblest and best of all the webs which political life admits, and enfolding therein all other inhabitants of cities, whether slaves or freemen, binds them in one fabric and governs and presides over them, and in so far as to be happy is vouchsafed to a city, in no particular fails to secure their happiness.
Your picture, stranger, of the king and statesman, no less than of the sophist, is quite perfect.